I was 31 the summer I decided to go on a solo camping trip in northern Michigan. I had taken some time off work after finishing a big project at the small construction company I worked for. It was August of 2019, and I remember the air being thick and warm even at night. I didn't have any real plan besides finding a quiet spot in the forest near Lake Superior, away from other people, and spending a few days there with nothing but a tent, a small cooler, and a backpack. I drove up from Grand Rapids and took back roads for most of the trip. It took about 9 hours with all the stops I made, and by the time I got to the logging road that led into the woods where I planned to camp, the sun was already starting to go down. I had looked at some old forest maps and found an area that was public land but pretty remote. There were no marked trails, no campsites, no buildings, just trees, old logging roads, and thick brush. It looked perfect to me. I drove slowly down the narrow dirt road with my windows rolled down. The sound of the tires on the gravel mixed with the chirping of crickets. After about 4 miles, the road became too overgrown to go any farther, so I parked in a little open patch just wide enough to turn around in. I pulled on my backpack, grabbed my gear, and walked about 20 minutes into the forest until I found a small clearing with a soft, mossy ground and a ring of trees around it. It felt hidden and safe. I set up my tent before it got too dark. It was just a cheap one-person tent I'd bought on sale the year before. I rolled out my sleeping bag, put my flashlight, knife, and bear spray next to it, and sat on a log to eat a sandwich I'd packed. The forest was quiet except for the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of something in the underbrush. I tried not to think about what those sounds were. I had no cell service out there, which was what I wanted, but I still made a mental note of how far I'd walked and what direction the road was in. That first night was uneventful. I lay in my tent listening to the woods, trying to fall asleep. I heard some movement nearby, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but nothing that made me nervous. The stars above the trees were the brightest I'd seen in years. I slept pretty well, only waking up a few times when I heard something snap in the distance. That's just part of being in the forest. The next day, I hiked a bit farther in, following a dry creek bed that wound through the trees. I brought a small folding saw with me and cleared a few branches from the path as I went. The sun filtered through the leaves and lit up patches of the forest floor. I saw a few chipmunks, some squirrels, and once, a group of wild turkeys that scattered as soon as they noticed me. I didn't see any signs of people, no trash, no footprints, nothing. It felt like I was the only one around for miles, which is what I had wanted. I spent the afternoon reading a paperback novel in the shade and napping on my sleeping bag. Around sunset, I gathered some dry sticks and small logs and made a fire. I cooked a hot dog on a metal skewer and ate it slowly while watching the flames. The sky turned orange, then dark blue. I felt calm and relaxed in a way I hadn't felt in months. But that night, something changed. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound that I couldn't immediately place. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp and quick, like metal tapping against something hard. At first, I thought it was just a branch falling, but then I heard it again, 2 short taps, then silence. It was maybe 30 feet away, behind my tent toward the trees. I sat up quietly, listening. My heart started to beat faster. I turned off my flashlight so I wouldn't draw attention. The tapping didn't come again, but I heard a soft crunch of leaves. Someone or something was walking. It was careful, almost like it was trying not to be heard, but the forest floor was dry and scattered with twigs. Whoever it was, they were moving slowly. I held my breath and listened. The steps circled to the side of my tent, maybe 15 feet away, and stopped. I could barely see anything outside, just shadows and the shapes of trees. I waited, gripping the knife I kept next to my sleeping bag. After a few minutes of silence, I heard more footsteps, this time moving away. They faded into the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night, staring at the top of my tent. I never heard anything else. No more steps, no more tapping, just silence and the occasional call of an owl. When the sun finally rose, I stepped out of the tent and looked around. There were no footprints, but the ground was hard, and the moss didn't show tracks easily. I didn't know what to make of it. Could have been a deer, I told myself, or maybe a coyote, but deep down, it didn't feel like an animal. The pacing, the tapping, it felt like a person. Maybe another camper or a hunter. But why would they be walking around so quietly in the middle of the night, that far from the road? Why would they sneak around my tent and then leave? I should have packed up and left, but I convinced myself it was probably nothing. I stayed a second night. I moved my tent a bit farther from the clearing, closer to some thick undergrowth where it was less visible. I kept the fire small and went to bed early, just as it was getting dark. That night, around the same time, 2:15 a.m. or so, I woke up again to a sound. This time it was a low rustling, followed by a quiet thud, like something being dropped. I lay still. It was closer than before. I could hear breathing, slow and steady, definitely not an animal. It was deep, too deep for a deer or raccoon. I held my breath again and sat up as quietly as I could. There was a faint scraping sound, metal on bark. Then nothing. I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag for almost an hour. Every few minutes I'd hear the faintest crunch or rustle, but never moving far. Whoever was out there wasn't in a hurry. They were just there, watching, maybe waiting. I didn't move until the sky began to lighten. When I finally stepped out of the tent just after dawn, I looked around again. This time there were signs. A small, smooth stone had been placed on top of my cooler. That wasn't there before. It was round, about the size of a golf ball, clean and dry. Next to it was a small, thin stick tied with a piece of twine into a rough X shape. I didn't bring any twine. I picked them both up and threw them deep into the woods. That was it. I packed everything. I took down the tent, shoved my gear into the pack, and didn't bother folding anything. I just wanted out. I hiked fast toward the road, checking behind me every few steps. My heart was pounding the entire way. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything following me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I reached the car, I threw everything into the back seat, slammed the doors, and locked them. I sat behind the wheel for a few minutes, just breathing. The morning light made everything feel safer, but I didn't believe it. Something had been watching me. Something had been out there. I started the engine and drove fast down the dirt road, swerving around the overgrown patches and bouncing over potholes. About a mile from where I had parked, I passed a small, dead rabbit hanging from a branch. Its legs were tied together with twine. I didn't stop. I didn't tell anyone about it when I got home. I didn't really know what to say. I just told my friends the trip was fine, quiet, nothing special. But for the next few months, I checked behind me every time I walked at night. I got motion lights installed around my house. I stopped going camping alone. Looking back, I don't know what exactly was happening out there. Maybe someone was living off the grid, deep in the woods, and didn't like me being near their area. Maybe it was a trapper or someone mentally unstable. But they didn't hurt me. They didn't even speak. They just watched, left signs, got close enough to let me know they were there. That's what scared me the most. The silence, the patience. It's been years now. I haven't been back to that area, and I don't plan to. I still camp sometimes, but only at regular campgrounds with people nearby. I always bring more gear than I need: extra flashlights, a satellite phone, a GPS tracker. I keep everything close, and I never wander too far off trails. That trip taught me something important. Being alone in the woods sounds peaceful, but the truth is, you don't know who or what is out there. Not every danger makes noise. Not every threat is loud or fast. Sometimes it's the quiet ones, the ones that wait and watch from the shadows, that stay with you the longest. In the summer of 2016, I took a solo camping trip that I've never been able to forget. I was 28 back then, living in Omaha, Nebraska, working a job that drained me mentally but paid enough to get by. I didn't have much of a social life, never really did, and I often spent my weekends hiking trails or staying at small cabins just to clear my head. But that year, I wanted to do something a little different. I needed to get out, far from the city, away from the hum of traffic and the stress of my job. I didn't want Wi-Fi, I didn't want noise, I didn't even want people around me. I just wanted woods, quiet, and time to think. I picked a spot in the western part of South Dakota, near the edge of the Black Hills. It was a place I'd read about in a few forums. Remote, rugged, and hard to reach unless you were willing to hike a few miles off-trail. The spot was near a small lake called Snyder Lake. It wasn't on most maps, which was exactly what drew me to it. I packed my gear carefully: tent, stove, food for 4 days, plenty of water, and a 9mm I kept locked in a case in my backpack, just in case. I wasn't expecting trouble, but being alone out there, it felt right to bring it. I also had a Garmin GPS and a topographic map with a compass as backup. I'd been camping for years, and I always took safety seriously. I left my car at a gravel pull-off along a forest road and started hiking in on a Friday morning. It took me over 4 hours to reach the lake. The hike wasn't easy. I had to cut through thick brush and climb over downed trees. The forest felt untouched, like nobody had passed through there in months. That was part of what made it feel special and a little unnerving. When I finally reached Snyder Lake, I was covered in sweat and mosquito bites, but the sight was worth it. The lake was small but clean, surrounded by pines and tall grass. I set up camp on the north shore where the ground was mostly flat. I pitched my tent facing the water and spent the rest of the afternoon gathering wood and making sure I had everything in place. The first night was peaceful. I cooked some rice and canned beans on my little camp stove, then sat on a rock by the lake, watching the sun go down. The air was cool, and the wind barely moved through the trees. No phone signal, no cars, no people. Just the sound of birds, frogs, and the occasional splash in the water. I went to bed early, probably around 9, and slept better than I had in weeks. The next day started off the same: calm, quiet, perfect. I hiked around the lake with my camera, taking photos of animal tracks, old moss-covered logs, and the strange rock formations along the far side of the lake. I found a beaver dam near the southern tip, with fresh gnaw marks on the trees. It felt good to be alone out there. For a while, it felt like I was the only person left in the world. That changed sometime late in the afternoon. I was sitting on a log near my tent, eating a granola bar, when I heard a noise in the distance. At first, it was just a rustling, something moving through the woods across the lake. I didn't think much of it, probably a deer or maybe a coyote. But then I heard it again, closer this time. Something heavy was moving through the trees. It wasn't the kind of light movement you get from a squirrel or even a large raccoon. These were heavy, deliberate steps, and they stopped and started in a way that made me freeze. I stood up and listened. The sound was coming from the east side of the lake, maybe 50 yards away, just inside the tree-line. I couldn't see anything, but I knew it was something big. I kept staring into the trees, waiting to catch a glimpse of fur or antlers, but nothing ever came out. After a few minutes, the sound stopped completely. I waited longer, still not seeing anything, then finally sat back down, telling myself it had to be an elk or maybe a black bear. I was in their territory after all. Still, I double-checked that the bear spray on my belt was ready to go. That night, I stayed closer to my fire. I didn't wander around as much, and I made sure my food was stored far away from the tent, sealed tight. I even moved the gun case closer to the tent entrance. I didn't sleep as well that night. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves had me opening my eyes. At one point, around 2 in the morning, I woke up to what sounded like faint footsteps outside my tent. I held my breath and sat up, listening hard. The steps were slow and soft, almost like someone trying not to make noise. I stayed perfectly still, my heart racing in my chest, and eventually the sound faded. I didn't open the tent or look outside. I was too afraid of what I might see. When morning came, I checked the area around my tent. Nothing was out of place, and I didn't see any prints. I thought maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the sound had just been an animal. I made some instant coffee and walked down to the water, trying to shake the unease. The day was overcast, and the wind had picked up, giving the trees a constant rustling that made it hard to hear anything else. I tried to enjoy it, but the feeling that I wasn't alone had settled deep in my gut. Around noon, I found something that made that feeling worse. I'd hiked up a small ridge about half a mile from camp, looking for a better view of the lake. While coming back down, I noticed something odd near a cluster of pines, an old campsite. At least that's what it looked like at first. There was a ring of rocks where a fire had been, long since cold. Some torn pieces of tarp were tangled in the underbrush, and I found a rusted-out pot lying nearby. But what really stuck out was the backpack. It was half buried in leaves and dirt, clearly weathered, but not completely rotted. I dug it out and checked inside. It was mostly empty, but there were some crushed food wrappers and a cracked plastic water bottle. The weird thing was, I hadn't read anything online about people camping out here recently. In fact, most of the posts I found before the trip were years old, saying how rare it was for anyone to go that deep. This campsite looked like it had been abandoned maybe a year ago, maybe less. I looked around for other signs, maybe a trail, but there was nothing. It didn't look like anyone had come back to pack it up. It felt like whoever had been there had just left it and never returned. I took a photo of the pack and left everything where I found it. I didn't want to disturb it any more than I already had. Back at my camp, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The footsteps, the heavy movement in the trees, the half-abandoned campsite. It was starting to feel like someone else was out there with me. I didn't want to panic, but I also didn't want to take any chances. I decided that if anything else weird happened, I'd pack up early and leave the next morning, even if it meant hiking out in the dark. That night, I made a bigger fire than usual and kept my flashlight on me at all times. I kept turning around while I cooked dinner, checking the tree line, scanning for movement. It was like being watched without seeing the person doing it. As the fire died down, I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and lay there with the gun beside my sleeping bag. I didn't plan on using it unless I had no other choice, but I felt better just knowing it was there. I must have fallen asleep eventually because the next thing I remember was waking up to a sound that made my blood go cold. It was the sound of something brushing against my tent. Not a branch or wind, but a hand or something like it, pressing lightly against the fabric. The tent moved inward slightly, as if someone was testing it. My eyes were wide open, staring into the darkness. Couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I just lay there, frozen, listening. The pressure stayed for a few seconds, then was gone. I waited, heart pounding in my ears, for what felt like hours. Eventually, I unzipped the tent just a few inches and peeked outside. It was pitch black, no moon, no stars. I couldn't see anything beyond a few feet. I pulled the zipper back down slowly and stayed awake the rest of the night, listening, waiting, never hearing anything else. The first light, I started packing. I didn't eat, didn't even brush my teeth. I just stuffed everything into my pack, rolled up the tent as fast as I could, and headed out. The woods felt different that morning, heavier, quieter. I kept looking over my shoulder every few minutes, convinced I was being followed. I didn't stop until I was nearly halfway back to my car, and even then, I only took a few sips of water before moving again. The whole time, I never saw a person. I never saw an animal, but the feeling that I was being watched never went away. When I finally reached my car, I tossed my gear in the back, got in, locked the doors, and just sat there for a while. My hands were shaking. My clothes were soaked with sweat. I didn't start the engine until I'd calmed down enough to focus. I never went back to that lake. I never even looked at the pictures I took during that trip. I deleted them a few weeks later, along with the GPS logs. Whatever happened out there, I didn't want to think about it anymore. I reported the abandoned campsite to the Park Service anonymously, just in case. I never heard anything back, and I didn't follow up. Now, years later, I still don't know who or what was out there with me. Maybe it was a drifter. Maybe it was someone hiding out in the woods, watching campers come and go. Maybe they weren't even dangerous, just strange, maybe mentally ill, maybe just trying to scare people away. I was 32 when I took that trip to Wyoming in late September 2019. I had just wrapped up a long contract working construction in Phoenix, and I needed a break from the noise, heat, and concrete. I'd always loved being alone in the woods, ever since I was a kid. I didn't grow up doing it often. My dad wasn't really the outdoors type, but I found out in my 20s that I liked the quiet more than I liked people. That trip was supposed to be a reset. No phone, no internet, no people, just me and the wild. I drove north through Colorado and into Wyoming in my beat-up 2001 Tacoma, camping gear in the back. I didn't have a solid plan, just a couple marked spots in a national forest I found through a few forums. Not the popular ones either, stuff farther out, less maintained. I ended up picking a spot about 45 miles southwest of Lander, deep in the Shoshone National Forest. It was a bit of a hassle to reach, unpaved roads, switchbacks, loose gravel, but that was the appeal. I didn't want to hear anyone else's voice. I didn't want another person's headlights passing my tent at night. I wanted total silence. The spot I settled on was maybe 2 miles off a little-used forest road. No real trail, just some signs of tire tracks that ended in a half-overgrown clearing. It was perfect. I parked under a few tall pines where the tree cover was dense but not too dark, and set up my old green tent about 20 yards away from the truck, on flat, dry ground. There was a small stream about 100 yards to the north, and behind me the forest climbed up slowly into a ridge. The spot was quiet, peaceful. I spent the first day hiking a little, gathering firewood and just sitting. The only sounds were wind through the trees and birds up high. No bears, no moose, no bugs really. It felt like I'd found the perfect place to disappear for a few days. I had packed enough food for about 5 nights, freeze-dried stuff, jerky, energy bars, a few cans. Water came from the stream after I ran it through my filter. Nights got cold fast that time of year, dropping into the 30s. I'd sit by the fire wrapped in a thick coat, sipping coffee or hot water, listening to the night sounds. I slept okay the first couple nights, woke up a few times, but that's normal for me when I camp. Nothing felt off. On the 3rd day, I hiked deeper up the ridge behind camp. The terrain wasn't steep, more of a steady incline through clusters of pine and spruce. I didn't go far, maybe a mile or so up, but I found a small overlook where I could see out over the forest. Just endless trees and distant hills. I sat there for a while, eating a protein bar, not thinking about much. Felt good. That night, I made a small fire again and ate one of the freeze-dried meals. I was getting used to the silence. The fire crackled soft and low, and I started to feel that odd shift you sometimes get after a few days in the woods. Like the world was shrinking down to just this one little patch of trees. It was peaceful, but there's also a weird edge to it. The kind that makes you feel very alone. Not in a scary way exactly, just in a raw way, like you remember how small you are. I went to bed just after the fire burned down, sometime around 9:30. The forest was quiet again, except for a few rustles in the distance and the faint sound of water from the stream. I bundled up in my sleeping bag and drifted off. I woke up around 1 a.m. to a strange noise. At first I thought it was wind pushing through the trees, but as I opened my eyes and listened, I realized it wasn't that. It was something closer, a low, steady scraping sound, not loud, almost like something was brushing against something else. I lay there, holding my breath, trying to pin it down. It was coming from the direction of the truck. I stayed still and waited, listening. The sound went on for maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. I didn't hear anything else after that, but it was enough to keep me awake. I lay there with my eyes open, ears straining. The wind picked up a little, but otherwise nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no animals. Eventually I fell back asleep, but not deeply. The next morning I got up, stretched, and stepped out into the cold air. The fire pit was cold and undisturbed. Nothing looked out of place. I walked toward the truck, and that's when I saw it. On the passenger side window, someone had drawn something. Not a word, just a circle with a line through it, like a crude no symbol. It was drawn in the thin layer of dust on the glass. I stared at it for a long time. There was no mistaking it, it hadn't been there before. I washed that window before I left home. It had to have been done during the night. I checked around the truck but didn't see any footprints. The ground was hard, dry, with pine needles all over, so it wouldn't have kept prints easily. I checked the doors. Still locked. Nothing missing. Just that single symbol. I don't scare easy, but that unsettled me. It meant someone had been near me while I slept. I walked around the perimeter of my little camp, checking for more signs, but I didn't find anything. No trash, no broken branches, nothing moved. Whoever did it was careful. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but part of me didn't want to overreact. I tried to reason through it. Maybe it was some ranger or hunter who stumbled on my truck and left a weird message. Maybe it was just a prank. I hated the idea of being scared off by something that small, so I stayed. I shouldn't have. That afternoon, I stayed close to camp. I didn't hike. I didn't want to leave anything unattended. I kept looking around more than usual, and I didn't like that. The whole day had a tight feeling in my chest, like I was being watched. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, but it didn't help. I went to bed with my headlamp and a knife tucked inside the sleeping bag with me. I didn't sleep much. Every sound felt louder, closer. At some point near dawn, I did fall asleep, but it was shallow. I woke up sore and on edge. That morning, things got worse. When I walked back to the truck, I found that all 4 tires had been deflated. Not slashed, not damaged, just let out. The caps were placed carefully on the ground next to each tire. That's what got me the most. It wasn't vandalism. It was precise, intentional. I started to panic a little. I got my little air pump out of the back and started inflating them one by one. It took over an hour, and I kept glancing around the trees the whole time, expecting someone to step out. But no one did. I made up my mind then. I was leaving that day. No matter what, something was off. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't some kid messing around. Someone had gone out of their way to mess with me, quietly, without being seen. I didn't want to know what else they might do. I packed up quickly, tossed everything into the back of the truck without bothering to fold it neatly. I kept checking behind me, and at one point I could have sworn I saw movement up the ridge, just a quick shift of something pale between the trees. I stared at that spot for a long time, but it didn't move again. I got in the truck, locked the doors, and started down the narrow forest road. The tires held, thankfully. I drove slow, cautious, heart thudding the whole time. Every turn felt like it might reveal something waiting for me, but nothing did. Just trees and empty road. It took me nearly 2 hours to get back to a paved highway. I stopped at the first gas station I saw and just sat there for a while. Doors locked, engine running. I looked over the truck. No new markings, no more flat tires. But the unease didn't fade. I never reported it. What would I say? That someone drew a weird shape on my window and let the air out of my tires? That I think someone was watching me for 2 nights in the woods? The sheriff would have shrugged it off. Or worse, not believed me. But I know what happened. Someone was out there. Someone careful. Someone quiet. They didn't steal anything. They didn't try to hurt me directly. But they made it very clear that I wasn't welcome. That I was being watched. And that they could get closer if they wanted to. I haven't been camping alone since then. I still hike sometimes, still go out in the woods. But never solo and never that deep. That trip reminded me that there are people out there who live in the margins, who know how to move through the woods without being seen. And sometimes they don't want to be found, or they don't want you to find them. I was lucky. Whoever it was, they let me go. Maybe they were just warning me. Maybe I was on their land, or near something I wasn't supposed to see. I don't know. I'll never know. But I won't forget that symbol on the window, or the way all 4 tires were perfectly deflated, like a message spelled out in silence. And I won't go back. I never thought a simple camping trip would turn into one of the most frightening experiences of my life. It was the summer of 2018, and I was 26 years old. I had decided to go camping alone, something I had done a few times before, but this time I chose a new place. A dense forest area in the Appalachian Mountains near a small town called Timber Ridge in West Virginia. I wanted a break from city noise, work stress, and everything else. I thought nature would clear my mind. I drove up the winding mountain roads early on a Friday morning. The sky was clear, the air fresh, and I felt a familiar excitement as I pulled off onto a gravel road leading into the forest. The trees were tall and thick, mostly oaks and maples with thick underbrush. Birds chirped, and a cool breeze moved through the leaves. I had done my research, and this part of the forest was popular among hikers but less crowded than the main parks. I carried my backpack with all the essentials: a small tent, sleeping bag, water filter, some canned food, a first aid kit, and a small camping stove. My phone had limited signal, but I didn't care. I was ready for peace and quiet. After hiking about 2 miles on a narrow dirt trail, I found a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and thick bushes. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles. It was perfect. I set up my tent, spread out my sleeping bag, and collected some dry wood for a fire. I even took the time to clear the area around the site, making sure there were no rocks or sharp sticks where I would sleep. The sun was starting to set as I built a small campfire. The orange flames flickered and cast long shadows through the trees. I heated some canned beans and ate slowly, listening to the sounds of the forest. The smell of pine and damp earth mixed with the faint scent of smoke. I felt calm. As the night deepened, the forest grew quiet except for occasional rustling of leaves and distant calls of animals. I laid back in my sleeping bag, staring up at the dark sky dotted with stars. The Milky Way stretched overhead, more brilliant than I had seen in years. I fell asleep feeling safe, at least for the moment. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. Something was wrong. The air felt colder, and I could hear the sound of heavy breathing nearby. My heart pounded in my chest. I stayed very still, trying to listen carefully. The breathing was slow but deep, steady. I realized it wasn't mine. It was coming from the darkness outside my tent. I reached slowly for my flashlight and turned it on, shining the beam just outside the tent flap. The light caught movement, shadows shifting among the trees. I could see a large shape crouching low, almost hidden by bushes. I didn't know what it was. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? A mountain lion? Or something else? I remembered the small can of bear spray in my pack. My hands trembled as I reached for it. The breathing continued, steady and close. The shape didn't move much but shifted slightly, as if trying to stay hidden but curious. I tried to stay calm and quiet, not wanting to provoke anything. Slowly, I unzipped the tent flap just a little and shone the flashlight toward the shape again. This time I could see the eyes, glowing faintly in the beam. They were too big and too low to be a person. A bear? Probably. I knew bears were common in this region, but they usually avoided humans. This one seemed different, more curious or perhaps hungry. I stayed frozen, trying not to make any sudden moves. The breathing was still there, loud enough to hear over the crackling fire. Then suddenly, the fire flickered and almost went out. The bear must have noticed. I grabbed a sturdy stick from my supplies and lit it on fire, holding it in front of the tent. The light startled the bear, and it backed off a few feet but didn't run. It just watched. I slowly pulled back inside the tent and zipped it closed tight. The bear stayed at the edge of the clearing for another few minutes, sniffing the air, then finally disappeared into the forest. I lay awake the rest of the night, heart pounding and every sound amplified. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump. I felt trapped and vulnerable. The isolation that once felt peaceful now felt dangerous. Morning came slowly. I was tired and shaky but relieved to see daylight. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed up as quickly as I could, making sure to clean up all food scraps and trash so I wouldn't attract any animals. The forest was quiet but felt different now, like it held secrets I didn't understand. On the hike back to my car, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the bear or something else following me. The path seemed longer, the trees closer, and the silence heavier. When I finally reached the gravel road and saw my car, I felt a huge wave of relief. I started the engine and drove away without looking back. That experience changed how I think about camping. I still love the outdoors, but I respect it more now. It's beautiful and peaceful, but it's also wild and unpredictable. Being alone in the forest at night, with a large animal so close, made me realize how small and vulnerable I really am. The scary part wasn't the bear itself. It's that I was completely unprepared for how close it got and how silent everything became. I learned to be more careful, to respect the land, and to never underestimate nature. From that day on, I always made sure to camp where others were nearby, to carry bear spray and noisemakers, and to keep my food stored safely away from the sleeping area. I still go camping sometimes, but I never forget that night in Timber Ridge. It was a clear reminder that the forest is not just a pretty place for a weekend getaway. It's a living, breathing world full of real dangers. And sometimes, the scariest moments come not from monsters or ghosts, but from the wildness of the natural world itself. I was 32 when I decided to take some time off work and go on a solo camping trip. I'd been working in an office in Columbus, Ohio, for over 7 years without more than a long weekend to myself. I was burnt out, mentally drained, and feeling like I needed to get away from everyone and everything for at least a week. I wasn't some expert outdoorsman, but I'd done enough weekend camping with friends in my 20s to feel confident about handling a solo trip. It was late September of 2022 when I started planning. I didn't want to go to a crowded campground, but I also didn't want to wander too deep into a national forest without cell service or access to help if something went wrong. I settled on Zaleski State Forest in southern Ohio. It was remote enough to feel like I was really getting away, but not so far off the grid that I'd be completely alone. I researched some trails and found one that looped through several backcountry campsites. I figured I'd spend 4 days hiking and camping along that loop. I packed everything carefully. My tent, a lightweight sleeping bag, a small stove, dehydrated meals, snacks, water purification tablets, a knife, flashlight, headlamp, a first aid kit, a tarp, a portable charger for my phone, and a hard copy map just in case. I even bought a personal locator beacon, just a small GPS unit that could send an emergency signal if I got into serious trouble. I wanted to enjoy solitude, not risk dying out there because I underestimated nature. I parked at the trailhead around 10 a.m. on a Tuesday, shouldered my pack, and started walking. The first day was quiet and pleasant. The air was cool, and the leaves had just started to change. I passed a couple of hikers coming the other way, but after an hour or so, I didn't see anyone else. I hiked a little over 7 miles that day and set up camp near a small creek. The site was peaceful, surrounded by tall trees and thick brush. I boiled some water for dinner, cleaned up, and got in my tent before the sun fully set. I read for a while with my headlamp and then fell asleep listening to the sound of running water. The second day started just as calm. I ate breakfast, packed up, and hiked deeper into the forest. The trail was narrower now, less maintained. There were stretches where I had to push branches out of my way and step carefully over fallen logs. I liked it that way. It felt like I was really out in the wild. I stopped for lunch at a clearing, then kept moving. Around mid-afternoon, I found the next designated campsite. It was on a small ridge, dry and open, with a view of the valley below. It was a bit windier than the first site, but the air felt clean and cool. That night, I started to feel a little uneasy. I hadn't seen another person since yesterday morning. I knew I was out in the woods for solitude, but something about the stillness started to feel unnatural. I brushed it off, probably just my brain adjusting to the silence after years of constant noise. I told myself it was good for me. I had dinner, made sure all my food was sealed in a bear bag and tied it to a tree far from my tent. Then I climbed into my sleeping bag and tried to get some rest. I woke up just after midnight to a sound. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. Leaves rustling, twigs snapping, something moving through the woods not far from my tent. I froze and held my breath, listening. It didn't sound like a deer. I'd heard deer move through woods before, and they're usually more graceful than whatever this was. It sounded more hesitant, like it would take a few steps, stop, then take a few more. I reached for my flashlight and sat up quietly, heart pounding. I didn't turn on the light right away. I didn't want to call attention to myself if someone or something was out there. I waited, ears straining, trying to judge the direction and distance of the sound. Circled my tent once, slowly. Not close enough for me to see a shadow, but close enough that I could hear every footstep. Then it stopped. Everything went quiet again. I stayed awake for a long time after that, holding the flashlight and knife in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of my tent. I kept telling myself it was probably a raccoon, maybe a coyote, something harmless. I eventually dozed off again, but I didn't sleep deeply. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and checked around the site. Nothing was disturbed. My food bag was untouched. There were no obvious tracks, at least not that I could see without knowing what I was looking for. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I almost considered hiking back to the car, but I told myself I was just spooked. I was halfway through the loop. Quitting now would mean either going back the way I came or rushing the rest of the trail in a single day. I decided to stick with the plan. That third day was quiet again. Too quiet. I kept checking over my shoulder as I walked. Every squirrel rustling in the leaves made me jump. I kept seeing shapes between the trees that weren't there. My pace quickened without me realizing it. I ended up reaching the next campsite much earlier than I expected. This site was lower in elevation, near a marshy area. The ground was softer, and the air was damp. I set up my tent on a patch of dry grass, filtered some water from a stream nearby, and sat against a tree to rest. I didn't feel as safe here. The thick brush and tall reeds around the marsh made it hard to see more than a few feet in any direction. I tried to read, but I couldn't focus. I kept looking up, scanning the woods. That night, I tried to fall asleep early, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I lay still, listening. The forest was louder here. Frogs croaking, insects buzzing, but underneath all of that, I kept picking up strange sounds. Small splashes in the marsh, something brushing against leaves. Once, I thought I heard breathing very faint, just outside the tent. I turned on my flashlight and shined it through the mesh window. Nothing. I sat there for over an hour, light in hand, staring out into the woods. Eventually, I unzipped the tent and stepped out, scanning the area. Still nothing. No movement, no sound. I walked over to the tree where I tied my food bag. It was still there, untouched. I stood still for a long time, just listening. Then I went back to the tent and sat in the entrance, staring into the dark, until I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke up just before dawn and knew something had changed. The zipper of my tent door was open, just a few inches, but I always closed it fully. Always. I sat up slowly and looked around. Everything inside the tent was where I'd left it. My pack, my boots, my jacket. But the zipper, that wasn't right. I got out of the tent and looked around again. The woods were still quiet. My food bag was gone. I walked over to the tree I'd tied it to. The rope was there, still looped around the branch, but the bag itself was missing. No torn scraps, no scattered food. Just gone. I stood there, frozen, feeling my chest tighten. An animal wouldn't have untied the rope like that. I didn't believe it was a bear or a raccoon. Someone had been in my camp while I slept. I didn't eat breakfast. I packed up everything as fast as I could. I left the site without even taking a break. I had about 6 miles left until I'd loop back to the trailhead. I figured if I hiked quickly, I could be out by early afternoon. But something changed on that last stretch. About 2 miles in, I noticed small things that didn't belong. A snapped branch hanging by a thread. Footprints, just 1 or 2, off the side of the trail. A piece of blue fabric snagged on a bush. I didn't know if it was paranoia or something real, but I felt like someone was just out of sight, keeping pace with me. I didn't stop, not even to drink water. I pushed myself hard, heart racing, legs burning, eyes darting to every movement in the trees. The wind picked up as the afternoon went on, and every gust made the forest seem more alive, more threatening. I started hearing things again. Twigs snapping behind me, footsteps that would stop when I stopped. Once, I saw a shadow move between 2 trees up ahead. I froze, waiting, but nothing came out. I walked wide around that spot, nearly tripping over a root. My pack felt heavier by the hour, and I started to get a cramp in my side, but I didn't dare stop. I just wanted to get out. I kept looking at the map and my GPS, checking how much further I had. Every step felt like a mile. I reached the trailhead just after 2 p.m. My car was still there, untouched. I tossed my pack into the back seat, climbed in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a long time, not starting the engine, just breathing. I looked back down the trail one last time. I didn't see anyone, but that didn't comfort me. I drove straight home without stopping. I didn't even listen to music, just silence. When I got back to my apartment, I took a long shower and collapsed into bed. I didn't sleep well for the next few nights. I never filed a report. I didn't have anything concrete to say, no proof, no clear sighting, nothing stolen except a bag of food. Just a gut feeling that someone had been watching me, following me, maybe just messing with me for fun, or maybe something worse. I was 34 when I decided to take a week off work and go on a solo camping trip. It was June 2021, and I had been feeling burned out from the long hours and never-ending meetings. I worked in logistics for a mid-sized company in Chicago, and even though I liked the work, I hadn't taken time off in over a year. I needed space, something different from screens, alarms, and schedules. I didn't want to go to a city or a beach. I wanted quiet, just trees, sky, and maybe a stream. I hadn't done much solo camping before, just one weekend trip the previous summer in Michigan, but I felt confident enough to try something more remote. I picked a place in northern Wisconsin near a small lake called Long Pine Lake. It wasn't part of a major national park, but it was known for having a few dispersed camping areas off some logging roads. No rangers, no marked campsites, no crowds. I found it by going down some forums and scrolling through blogs until I came across a guy who posted GPS coordinates for a clearing he had camped at. It looked peaceful, and I figured it wouldn't be busy, which is exactly what I wanted. I packed my gear carefully over 2 days: tent, sleeping bag, small gas stove, bear spray, compass, maps, freeze-dried food, a headlamp, a knife, plenty of water, and a solar charger. I even brought a small hatchet I had only used once before. I planned to stay 4 nights. I left on a Wednesday morning, early, around 5 a.m., and drove for about 7 hours. The last hour was all back roads. No cell service. My GPS had been preloaded, so it still worked, but it felt weird not being able to check anything or message anyone. I had told my brother and a friend where I'd be, just in case. I turned off onto a narrow gravel road that got bumpier the deeper I went. Trees crowded the sides of the road so close that I slowed to about 10 miles an hour. It was already afternoon, and light filtered through the trees in those soft strips that made everything glow a little. I found the spot eventually. The clearing was about 20 yards across, flat and ringed by tall pines. About 50 feet away, through some brush, was the lake. The water was calm, with just a few dragonflies skimming the surface. It was perfect. I parked my Subaru Outback just off the path and got to work. I pitched my tent near the tree line so I'd have shade in the morning. I collected some dry wood, cleared a small fire ring with stones, and got my gear organized. I even hung up a bear bag with my food about 30 feet up a tree. I wasn't too worried about bears, but I knew better than to leave food lying around. I spent the first evening just settling in. I boiled some water for one of those freeze-dried pasta meals, watched the sun go down over the lake, and crawled into my sleeping bag as the night got cool. The first night was peaceful. I heard some rustling outside the tent, probably small animals or wind in the trees, but nothing that set off alarm bells. I slept a bit unevenly, like I always do when I'm not in my own bed, but I felt good the next morning. I made coffee, ate a granola bar, and went for a walk around the edge of the lake. I didn't see a single person or hear any cars in the distance, just the soft lapping of water and birds. It was exactly what I had come for. Later that day, I walked deeper into the woods on one of the side trails I found. It wasn't marked, but it was clearly used now and then. I followed it for about an hour before turning back. When I got back to my camp, I noticed something that didn't register right away. Some of the smaller sticks I had placed near the fire ring were gone. I figured an animal had taken them or scattered them, so I didn't think too much about it. I res-tacked what was left, gathered a few more branches, and made dinner. That second night felt different. Not bad, just quieter. I know that sounds strange, but it was the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I didn't hear any owls or wind, just stillness. I lay in my sleeping bag for a while before falling asleep. At some point in the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. I just opened my eyes and felt alert. I stayed still and listened. I heard something faint, maybe 20 feet away. It sounded like a step, just one. Then nothing. I waited. I was too scared to unzip the tent. My heart was going fast. After a few minutes, I heard a second sound, another step. It was very light, like someone carefully placing their foot on dry leaves. It stopped again. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, clutching the knife I had next to my sleeping bag. Eventually, I must have drifted off, because I woke up with the early light just starting to show through the tent. I got out and looked around. Nothing was disturbed. The ground was the same. The bear bag was untouched, and the air smelled fresh and clean like nothing had happened. I tried to shake off the unease. Maybe I had just imagined it, or maybe a deer had wandered by, but it had sounded different, controlled, cautious. That day, I stayed closer to camp. I didn't want to wander far. I brought my camp chair down to the lake and sat for a while, watching the water. I saw a few fish jump, and a couple of ducks flew overhead. I ate some nuts and read a book I had brought. I tried to relax, but I kept glancing back toward the trail. I don't know what I thought I'd see, but I couldn't help it. I made a small fire that evening, mostly for the comfort of it. I sat by it after dark, poking at the coals. I listened. Every sound seemed louder now. A branch snapping somewhere made me freeze. It was far, maybe 200 feet into the trees. Then nothing. I didn't stay up much longer after that. That night was worse. I woke up again, same as before, not knowing what had stirred me. This time, I waited with my ears straining. I heard breathing, very faint. It wasn't mine. It was slow, careful breathing. Then a step, then another. It was circling the tent. I stayed completely still, barely even breathing. It was so quiet I could hear the nylon of the tent shift slightly in the breeze. The steps moved a little closer, then stopped. Then they started again, but farther away. Then nothing. I didn't sleep again. As soon as the light started coming up, I got out and looked around. Again, nothing obvious was wrong, but this time I noticed something that stopped me cold. A footprint, just one, near the edge of the clearing, close to the tree line. It wasn't mine. It was wider and a little longer, and the tread pattern was different from my boots. I knelt and looked closely. It was fresh, made sometime during the night. It was angled toward my tent. I felt a deep pressure in my chest. This wasn't an animal. Someone had been walking around my tent, slowly, carefully, and they were barefoot or wearing very soft shoes. I didn't know what to do. I thought about packing up and leaving right away, but I felt frozen. Who was out here? Why hadn't they said anything? Why didn't they approach during the day? I didn't know what they wanted. That scared me more than anything. I felt like prey. I decided I'd leave the next morning. I didn't want to drive that road at night, and I thought if I stayed awake all night with my knife and headlamp, I'd be okay. I spent the day jumpy and distracted. I checked the trees constantly. I took short naps in my chair in the daylight, just trying to get any rest I could before night came. When the sun dropped, I didn't light a fire. I thought it would be better to stay dark. Maybe whoever it was would think I had left. I pulled my gear into the tent and zipped everything up. I kept the knife in one hand and the bear spray in the other. I didn't sleep. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard them again. No breathing this time, but footsteps. Light, soft. They came from the direction of the trail, and they moved slowly around the clearing. They paused. Then I heard something that chilled me completely. A soft scrape, like a boot or shoe dragging over stone. Then nothing. Silence again. But I knew they were there, just outside the trees. I stayed still until light. When the sun finally came up, I got out and packed in a frenzy. I didn't care about breakfast or coffee. I shoved everything into the car. Tent, sleeping bag, even stuff I normally would have folded or rolled. I didn't want to be there a second longer. As I was about to open the driver's door, I looked back toward the tree line. There was another footprint, this one closer, just a few feet from where I had hung the bear bag, and next to it a small scrap of cloth, camouflage pattern, like from a jacket or pants. It looked like it had torn off on a branch. I didn't touch it. I drove out of there fast, bumping down the logging road harder than I should have. I didn't stop until I got to a gas station an hour and a half away where there was finally cell service. I texted my brother and told him I was heading home early. I didn't explain much. I still think about that trip. I haven't gone camping since. I still hike, still spend time outdoors, but I always stay in public areas now, near other people. I never camp alone anymore. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted or why they didn't speak or show themselves. Maybe it was someone living off-grid. Maybe it was someone looking to scare people. Maybe it was worse. All I know is they watched me, moved around my camp at night, stepped closer each time. Quiet, careful. They could have done something. I was 34 the summer I decided to take a break from everything. I'd been working long hours for months straight, living in a crowded part of Chicago, barely seeing daylight except for the few blocks between my apartment and the train station. I was worn out, mentally more than physically, and something just snapped after a rough week in late June. I told my boss I was taking a week off and didn't wait for a response. That night, I pulled out my old camping gear from the closet, packed what I could into my car, and by sunrise, I was driving northwest toward Wisconsin. I didn't have a set destination. I just wanted to be somewhere quiet, surrounded by trees, far away from people and city noise. I stopped at a gas station past Wausau, picked up a couple of paper maps and snacks, and asked the guy at the counter where I could camp without much traffic. He pointed toward the edge of Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest and told me about an old Forest Service road that led to a few remote spots. I thanked him, bought some more water, and headed that way. By early afternoon, I was deep into the forest. The road was narrow and full of potholes, barely more than a wide dirt trail. My car wasn't made for that kind of terrain, but I took it slow. Eventually, I reached a small clearing. No other cars, no signs, just a flat spot near a quiet creek with thick trees all around. It looked perfect. I turned off the engine and stepped out. All I could hear were birds and the sound of water running over rocks. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. I set up my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and stacked some firewood I had brought. After that, I just sat for a while. I watched squirrels chase each other through the trees and felt the tension in my shoulders start to melt away. There was no cell signal, which was exactly what I wanted. No notifications, no emails, just the sound of nature. That first night, I built a small fire, ate a simple meal of canned chili and crackers, and sat watching the flames until the stars came out. I hadn't seen a sky that clear in years. I climbed into my tent, zipped it shut, and slept better than I had in months. The next morning, I walked upstream, filled my water bottle with filtered creek water, and spent the day hiking and sitting on rocks, doing absolutely nothing. Felt good. It was on the third night that things started to feel different. The day had gone fine. I hiked deeper into the forest, following a rough game trail that led to a rocky ridge with a view of miles of green treetops. I didn't see anyone all day, which was normal for that area. But when I got back to camp around dusk, something seemed off. Nothing was moved, nothing stolen, but I had this strange sense that I wasn't alone. I kept looking around as I made dinner, listening for branches snapping or animals moving through the woods, but it was quiet. Too quiet, actually. I'd gotten used to the rustling of chipmunks and birds by then, but that evening it felt like everything had gone still. Even the wind had stopped. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe the stillness was normal. Maybe I was just not used to being disconnected from the noise of daily life. I got into my tent earlier than usual and kept my flashlight next to me. I woke up sometime past midnight. I'm not sure what woke me. Maybe a sound, maybe just instinct, but my eyes opened fast, and I held my breath. I lay still, listening. It was dark. My flashlight was right by my head, but I didn't move. I heard something outside. Not an animal. Something heavier. Footsteps. They were slow, measured, and they moved around the tent once. Not directly close, maybe 15 or 20 feet away, just out past the fire pit. I didn't hear voices. No talking. Just the sound of something moving carefully through the brush. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour, though it was probably just 10 minutes. Eventually, the sounds faded away. I didn't sleep again. I waited until the first hint of daylight, unzipped the tent, and stepped outside. Everything looked normal. No trash disturbed, no boot prints, no broken branches, nothing obvious. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I spent the morning packing up camp. I didn't want to, not really, but I kept remembering those footsteps. I told myself it could have been a deer, or maybe even a bear, though bears usually aren't that quiet. And they don't circle tents like that. I was almost ready to leave when I noticed something. About 50 feet from my camp, near a tree that had fallen across the edge of the clearing, I saw the remains of an old fire. Not mine. The ashes were cool, but fresh enough to still be dark gray. I hadn't noticed it before, and it looked like it hadn't been there more than a day or two. Someone else had been here. That was enough for me. I threw my gear in the car and drove back the way I came. I didn't stop until I reached a small town just outside the forest, where I bought a coffee and used their Wi-Fi to check the map. I found another site further west and closer to a state-managed campground, but still remote enough to be quiet. It had a ranger station nearby. I figured I'd feel safer there. I set up camp again that evening in a designated spot, far enough from the main road but not completely isolated. A few other campers were parked in the distance, and I could see one RV through the trees. That helped me relax a bit. I didn't light a fire that night. I just cooked on a small stove and went to bed early. I didn't hear anything strange. The next day, I hiked around the nearby trails and spent time near a small lake. I started to feel more like myself again. I stayed in that area for 2 more nights, and nothing unusual happened. The forest felt normal again. Birds singing, squirrels chattering, wind in the trees. On the 5th day, I packed up and drove home, thinking maybe I just imagined everything. A few weeks passed. I settled back into my routine. The city didn't seem quite so loud now. I started sleeping better and felt more focused at work. But every now and then, when I was alone at night, I'd remember those footsteps and that second fire. I started looking up stories online, news from that area, missing persons reports, anything strange in that part of the forest. That's when I came across a local forum post. It was buried deep in a thread about camping safety. A guy had posted about finding creepy signs of squatters near a Forest Service road west of Wausau, same area I had been. He'd found an old trail camera set up facing a small clearing. The memory card had pictures, blurry, low-quality images taken late at night. Most were just shots of trees and animals, but one photo showed a person. No face, just a figure standing still between 2 trees, taken around 2:30 a.m. The date stamp on the photo was 3 days before I had camped there. He turned the pictures over to the local sheriff, but there wasn't much they could do. No clear ID, no crime committed. Just some unknown person out in the woods in the middle of the night. I didn't sleep well after reading that. I deleted the post and shut my laptop. I didn't need to see more. I knew what I'd heard. I knew it wasn't just in my head. That person had been near my tent, walking slowly, circling me while I lay there in the dark. Now, I still go camping, but I don't go alone anymore. I stay in areas with other people around, and I always let someone know where I'm going. I still love the forest, the quiet, the air, but I learned something that week. Out there, miles from anyone, it's not the animals you have to worry about. It's the people, the ones you don't hear until they're already watching you. I was 32 when I decided to spend a week camping in the northern part of Idaho, near the Canadian border. It was July of 2017, and I had just taken time off after a stressful stretch at my warehouse job in Boise. I'd been pushing myself too hard. Overtime, long commutes, late-night shifts. I needed to get away from everything for a while. My plan was simple. Head out alone, find a secluded spot, turn off my phone, and just live with the quiet. I drove 6 hours up to Boundary County, near a stretch of forest land about 20 miles west of Bonners Ferry. The area wasn't popular with tourists or campers. Too remote, too rough, and that's exactly what I wanted. I had a decent tent, some basic gear, a well-worn backpack, and enough food for the week. My plan was to hike in about 4 miles from the nearest dirt road, find a spot near a creek I'd marked on a topographic map, and set up camp there. When I arrived, the sky was overcast but dry. The air smelled like pine and wet dirt. I parked my car off a gravel road, locked everything up, and slung my pack on. The first few hours of hiking were uneventful. The trail wasn't maintained, but I was used to that. There were fallen logs, overgrown brush, and the occasional patch of mud, but nothing I couldn't handle. By mid-afternoon, I found the creek I was aiming for, about 20 feet wide, running strong and cold. The forest around it was dense but not suffocating. I found a flat area a little ways from the bank and cleared it for my tent. That first night was quiet. I sat on a log, cooked some freeze-dried chili, and listened to the sound of the water. No people, no noise, no phones. Just the wind in the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. When it got dark, I crawled into my sleeping bag and fell asleep quickly. The next day, I spent exploring upstream. The creek twisted through the woods, running over stones and under fallen trees. I moved slowly, taking in the details, the insects on the surface of the water, the animal tracks near the edge, the quiet. I followed the creek for a couple of miles before turning back. I made a mental note of a strange half-collapsed structure about a mile upstream. It looked like an old trapper's shelter, just some rotting wood and rusted nails. I didn't think much of it. There were remnants of old logging and trapping routes all over this part of the state. By the third day, I'd settled into the rhythm of things. I boiled water, hiked, wrote in a little notebook I'd brought, and sat by the fire. But that night, something woke me up. I don't know what time it was, but it was still dark out. I opened my eyes and listened. At first, I thought it was just a dream, or maybe an animal. Then I heard the sound again, something moving through the brush. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. A deliberate rustling, like someone stepping over twigs and dry leaves. Paused, then started again. I held my breath and stayed still. I've heard deer, elk, and even bears at night while camping, but this sounded different. It was too consistent, too cautious. After a few minutes, it stopped altogether. I stayed awake for hours after that, listening. I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I must have drifted off again. In the morning, I got up and checked the perimeter of my site. Nothing looked disturbed. There were no prints, no signs of anything unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a porcupine. Still, I decided to be more cautious. I packed a few things and hiked a wider loop that day, trying to put the night out of my head. When I returned to camp, everything was as I'd left it. The fourth night was quiet. I heard some owls, a few distant yips from coyotes, but nothing unusual. I started to relax again. Maybe I'd just imagined it. Maybe my city-wired nerves were playing tricks on me. I fell asleep with the sound of the creek nearby and didn't wake up once. But the next morning, I noticed something small that unsettled me. One of my hiking poles, which I'd left leaning against a tree near my tent, was lying on the ground about 10 feet away. I always put them in the same place, and there was no wind during the night. It was a little thing, but it didn't sit right with me. I thought about packing up and heading back early, but I convinced myself it wasn't worth it. I was halfway through my trip. I'd brought plenty of supplies, and I'd come out here to reset. I didn't want to let paranoia ruin that. Still, I started carrying my knife on my belt during the day. I also began hanging my food a little higher in the trees, just in case. That afternoon, I walked downstream along the opposite bank of the creek. I hadn't explored that side yet. It was thicker, more tangled with brush and downed trees. I had to duck under branches and wade through thorny patches. After about half an hour, I found a small clearing with a fire ring made of stones. It looked old, moss-covered, half-collapsed, but there were signs someone had used it not long ago. Some of the stones were soot-stained. A couple of blackened sticks still sat inside the ring. I crouched down and ran my fingers over them. Dry, not freshly used, but recent enough. Maybe a few weeks, maybe days. It wasn't a marked site. No trails led to it. No signs, no trash, no footprints. Just this forgotten spot tucked away in a dense corner of the woods. I didn't like the feeling it gave me. I turned back soon after. That night, I kept the fire going longer than usual. I didn't like the idea of someone else being out there. These woods were supposed to be empty, untraveled. I sat on a log and stared into the flames, listening. Just before midnight, I thought I heard a branch crack somewhere across the creek. Just one sharp snap, like someone stepping on it. I froze. It didn't come again. I went to bed with my boots still on. The next morning, I walked a wide loop around my site again. Still nothing. No footprints. No broken branches. No disturbed ground. But when I opened my food bag to prep breakfast, I noticed something was missing. One of the sealed energy bar packs was gone. I knew I had 5 left. Now there were 4. I checked my pack, checked the tree where I'd hung it, checked the ground. Nothing. That was it for me. Something was wrong. I'd camped alone dozens of times and never had anything stolen. I packed everything up, fast and efficient. I made a plan to hike straight back to the car. I figured I could make it in under 3 hours if I moved fast. I was maybe 1.5 miles into the hike when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In a patch of soft ground near a bend in the trail, I saw a footprint. A human one. No boot tread, just a bare heel and toes. It was angled the same direction I was walking, like someone had gone ahead of me. It was fresh, pressed deep into the damp soil. I crouched and studied it. Adult-sized, maybe a man. No other prints around it, just that one, as if the person had been moving carefully, not following the trail directly. I stood up and looked around. The trees were still, the air silent. I didn't wait. I kept moving, faster now, almost jogging with my gear. About half an hour later, I noticed another print. This one was on the slope to my right, near a patch of ferns. It wasn't clear, just the impression of weight against the leaves. Again, no shoes. I didn't stop again after that. I pushed hard, legs burning, throat dry, until I reached the spot where I'd parked. The car was still there, untouched. I threw my gear into the trunk, slammed the door, and peeled out down the gravel road. Back in Bonner's Ferry, I got a room at a cheap motel and locked the door tight. I spent the night going over everything in my head. The noises, the footprint, the missing food, the old fire ring, the moved hiking pole. None of it was dramatic or flashy. No loud confrontations, no masked figures, no chases. But all of it added up to something that I couldn't ignore. Someone was out there, watching me, moving around at night, getting into my stuff, staying close, just far enough not to be seen. No one knew where I was, and I hadn't seen another person the entire time. If I hadn't left when I did, I don't know what would have happened. I never reported it. What could I say? There were no threats, no clear crimes, just things that felt off. But I never went back to that part of the forest again. I still camp sometimes, but only in places where I know people pass through. I leave a trip plan with friends now, and I carry a satellite beacon. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't a ghost. It was just a person, quiet, careful, and watching. And to me, that's a lot scarier. It was the summer of 2017, a few weeks after my 27th birthday. I decided to take a trip alone, a break from the noisy city and the endless screen time. I found a remote camping spot in the mountains of northern Vermont, an area I'd never been before but always wanted to explore. I chose a small state park called Green Ridge, far from any major roads or towns, surrounded by dense forest and steep hills. The place was known for its quiet trails and clear night skies. I arrived just before sunset, carrying my backpack with the basics. A tent, sleeping bag, water filter, some canned food, a small stove, and a couple of books. I had done a little research online but kept the trip simple. No hiking more than a few miles from my car, no complicated gear, just solitude and fresh air. The drive itself was long and winding, passing through small villages and endless fields before the road narrowed and climbed steeply into the mountains. I felt the change immediately. The air smelled different, cooler and heavier with pine and earth. Birds sang low and scattered, and the trees grew taller and thicker as I neared the park entrance. After checking in at the ranger station, I drove a little farther until I found a campsite marked Lone Pine. It was one of the last sites before the road ended at a trailhead. The spot was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by towering pines, the ground soft with moss and fallen needles, and a gentle creek running about 30 feet away. I unloaded my gear slowly, taking my time to set up the tent. The sun dipped low behind the trees as I worked, casting long shadows and turning the sky a deep orange. The woods felt quiet but alive. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional splash from the creek. Once my tent was pitched, I gathered some dry wood for a fire, careful to pick only fallen branches and not disturb the living trees. The forest floor was covered in a thick carpet of brown and green, with ferns and small wildflowers peeking through the underbrush. The air smelled like wet wood and earth, and I could hear the steady drip of water from leaves after a light rain that had passed earlier in the day. I started the fire with matches, feeling the small flames lick the air as they caught onto the kindling. The warmth was comforting against the chill that crept in as night approached. I cooked a simple meal of rice and beans on the stove, eating slowly and watching the dark deepen beyond the fire's glow. By the time the stars came out, the sky was completely black except for the pinpricks of light above. The Milky Way stretched across the sky, brighter and clearer than I had ever seen in the city. I lay back on a blanket, eyes tracing the constellations, feeling small but peaceful. As the fire died down to embers, I crawled into my tent, zipped the door closed, and settled onto my sleeping pad. The night was cool, but my sleeping bag kept me warm. Outside, the forest was alive with quiet noises. The crack of a branch, the scurry of small animals, the distant hoot of an owl. Sleep came slowly. I was alert to every sound, every rustle outside. The silence was heavy and deep, different from the white noise of the city. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I woke before dawn, cold and stiff from sleeping on the hard ground. The sky was pale and gray, and a thin mist hung low over the trees and creek. I stepped outside to stretch and breathe in the fresh, damp air. The creek was running faster from the overnight rain, water clear and cold over smooth rocks. I spent the day hiking short trails, photographing the forest and wildlife with my small camera. The woods were beautiful and untouched, filled with towering pines, thick moss, and patches of bright green ferns. I spotted a few deer grazing quietly in a clearing and a pair of hawks circling high above. That night, I repeated the routine: fire, food, star watching, tent. But as the darkness deepened, something felt different. The woods seemed less friendly. The quiet noises were sharper and closer. My senses sharpened, the hairs on my arms prickling. Around 11 p.m., I heard a new sound, something slow and heavy moving through the underbrush. At first, I thought it was a deer, but it was too loud, too deliberate. It sounded like footsteps, not fast, but steady, slow steps just beyond the clearing. I stayed still, heart beating fast, staring out the tent window at the shadows between the trees. The steps stopped for a moment, then started again, closer this time. My mind raced with possibilities: a lost hiker, a ranger, or something more threatening. The fire was nearly out. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, shining the beam into the dark woods. The light caught nothing but the empty trunks of trees and thick bushes. The footsteps stopped. A long silence followed, broken only by the creek's murmur. I debated leaving the tent, but the dark, cold forest felt unsafe. I clutched a small pocket knife in my hand and waited, listening. The night stretched on. Nothing moved. The next morning, I found something strange near the creek. Footprints, large and deep, not like any animal I'd seen. The prints were human-sized but oddly shaped, with a heavy heel and wide sole, as if someone had been wearing large boots. They headed away from my campsite toward a thicker part of the woods. I felt uneasy but decided to follow the trail carefully. The footprints led me to a small clearing I hadn't noticed before, filled with old, rotting logs and fallen branches. The ground was soft and damp, and the air smelled musty and cold. There, I saw signs of a fire pit, long unused but recently disturbed. Around the fire pit, I found scraps of torn cloth and a rusted canteen. Someone had been here not long ago, maybe even during the night. The thought unsettled me deeply. I decided to pack up and leave after the day's hike, not wanting to stay longer near the signs of someone else in such a remote place. But as the sun lowered again, strange sounds returned. Low, heavy breathing from just outside my tent, the crackle of dry leaves under heavy steps. I stayed awake, flashlight ready, watching the trees. Suddenly, a shadow moved quickly along the edge of the clearing, too fast and low to be a deer. The silhouette was human-shaped, but the figure never came close enough to see clearly. I stayed still and quiet, heart pounding, waiting for it to go. Morning brought no sign of the figure. I packed quickly, checked my map and GPS, everything normal, and started the walk back to my car. As I crossed the last stream before the road, I saw footprints again. This time there were more of them, overlapping and going in different directions. I stopped and looked around, uneasy. These prints were fresh, the mud still soft, the edges sharp. Something about them told me I wasn't alone out here. The feeling wasn't fear of ghosts or stories, but a real human presence. Someone watching, someone nearby. I quickened my pace, eyes scanning every shadow. When I finally reached the parking lot, the relief was overwhelming. The normal sounds of cars and people felt strange but welcome. I loaded my gear into the car, locked the doors, and sat for a moment, breathing hard. Driving away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror at the trees that hid the campsite. The mountains and forest looked the same as when I arrived, but something about the place had changed in my mind. Back in the city, I told myself I had experienced something real, not supernatural. The footsteps, the fire pit, the shadow in the night, all signs of someone else living or hiding in the woods. The thought of who or why stayed with me for weeks, but I never went back. Sometimes, I wonder if that person is still out there, watching the trails and the small clearings, waiting for someone else to come. I went on a solo camping trip in the fall of 2022. I had just turned 34, and after a stressful stretch at work in Fort Collins, Colorado, I needed to get away from everything. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just time alone, surrounded by trees, quiet air, and no phone signal. I chose a remote spot in the San Juan Mountains, somewhere about 2 hours southwest of Lake City. I had looked it up on a few forums where other campers shared good spots off the beaten path. I wanted remote but not dangerous, somewhere with hiking trails, running water nearby, and maybe some decent views. What I found was a dirt road that cut through forest land and ended near a narrow creek bed with thick pine trees all around. I drove out early on a Wednesday morning in late October. The weather was cold, but not freezing yet. The kind of cold that makes your fingers ache a little when you first step out of the truck, but not cold enough to stop you from setting up a tent. My truck was packed with a tent, sleeping bag, small propane stove, freeze-dried food, bear canister, water jugs, a folding chair, and a few emergency supplies. Basic things like a first aid kit, headlamp, tarp, and a hatchet. When I got to the trailhead, I parked near a fallen log that blocked further access. From there, it was about a half-mile walk to the flat area I had picked out on the map, just east of a narrow creek that flowed down from the hills. I took my pack and started walking in. The trail was rough, not even a real trail anymore, just flattened grass and the occasional game path. No signs, no markings, no other tire tracks or footprints in the soft dirt. Just the sound of the wind through the trees and the quiet crunch of my boots. After maybe 25 minutes, I found a flat spot tucked between tall evergreens with some natural cover from the wind. The creek was about 40 feet away, which was perfect. I set up my tent facing west so I could see the sun start to dip through the trees in the evening. I spent the first day settling in, gathering small dry branches, heating water on the stove for coffee, checking for any signs of animals nearby. I didn't see much, just a few rabbit tracks and some droppings that looked like elk. No bears, no people. That first night was peaceful, cold, but peaceful. I bundled into my sleeping bag wearing 2 layers and a beanie, listening to the creek gurgle faintly in the distance. I kept a small flashlight next to me and my knife under the sleeping pad. Habit more than anything else. I've always done that when I camp alone, even though I've never needed it. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something rustling outside the tent, but it was faint, probably a small animal, maybe a raccoon or deer. I stayed quiet and it moved off after a few minutes. The second day, I spent a few hours exploring uphill. The land sloped into a rocky rise that overlooked the creek valley. I could see down to where the trees thickened into dense forest. There wasn't much wildlife. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just wind and silence. I didn't think much of it at the time. Sometimes places are just quiet. I went back to camp around mid-afternoon and made a small fire from dry branches I'd stacked nearby. I heated up a pouch of beef stew and sat watching the fire until it burned down to red embers. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The wind had picked up. It wasn't stormy, just restless. The kind of wind that moves tree branches in short, sudden bursts, making odd creaking noises as the trunks sway. I kept hearing little things. Snaps, crunches, thumps. Some close, some farther off. I kept telling myself it was just trees settling or animals moving around. But something about it felt off. Like it was always just beyond the edge of where I could see or hear clearly. I stayed awake until almost 4 before finally drifting off for a few hours. The next morning, I walked back toward the truck just to check on things. I didn't bring everything back with me, just a water bottle and my phone. Even though there was no signal, I found the truck untouched, but as I turned to head back, I noticed something in the dirt about 20 feet off the road. A footprint, not a boot print, not mine. It looked like a regular athletic shoe, maybe a running shoe. Smaller than my foot. Not fresh, but not old either. It had rained lightly a few days before, and the print looked like it had been made after that. I stared at it for a while, looking for others, but there was just that one. Alone. I tried not to let it bother me. Maybe someone had been out there earlier in the week. A hunter or a hiker. It was public land after all. Still, it put me on edge. I hiked back to my camp slower, paying more attention to the trees around me. I started to feel like I wasn't alone. Not in an obvious way. Just small things, the way a branch would snap twice in a row, or how the forest would suddenly go quiet like it was holding its breath. I started marking the trees as I passed them with small pieces of twine I had in my pack, just to make sure I wasn't looping back unknowingly. Every time I was on track. Back at camp, nothing looked touched. My tent was closed, my gear undisturbed, the food canister still sealed. I sat for a while trying to relax, eating a protein bar and sipping water, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I packed up some of my gear and decided I'd cut the trip short. I figured I'd sleep one more night and then head out early in the morning. That final night was the worst. I didn't start a fire. I didn't eat. I just sat inside the tent with my sleeping bag zipped up, flashlight off, listening. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Not animals, human footsteps. Slow, deliberate, walking through the brush maybe 30 or 40 feet away. The kind of steps that stop and start like someone trying not to be heard. I stayed completely still. I had my knife in my hand under the sleeping bag, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. The steps got closer, then stopped. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I waited. Nothing. No sound for almost an hour. Then more steps moving away. I lay awake until sunrise, not moving a muscle. When light finally came, I crawled out of the tent and packed as fast as I could. I didn't even eat. I shoved everything into my bag, broke down the tent with frozen fingers, and made my way down to the truck. As I got closer, I started to smell something weird, like metal and rot. The kind of smell you get when something dead's been lying out for a while. When I reached the truck, I found the carcass of a deer laid across the hood. The stomach was cut open, clean, almost surgical. No blood, just empty. I didn't look too long. I tossed my gear in the truck, started it, and drove the hell out of there. I didn't stop until I was halfway back to town. I pulled into a gas station outside Montrose and sat in the cab for almost an hour, just breathing and trying to calm down. I never reported it. What was I going to say? That someone left a dead deer on my truck in the middle of nowhere and walked around my tent all night? There was no proof, no one around, and nothing that could really be followed up on. I told a friend about it a few months later, but even then I left out most of the details. I haven't gone camping alone since then, and I won't. Not ever again. I don't know who was out there with me, Maybe some sick hunter. Maybe someone living off-grid and dangerous. Maybe just a messed up person who liked to scare people. Whoever it was, they didn't say anything, didn't leave tracks, didn't take anything. They just watched. And when I left, they left a message. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a scare. It was a reminder how far you are from help out there, how fast things can turn, and how some people go into the woods not to get away from the world, but to do things they can't do in it. That trip changed how I look at being alone. I used to love the silence. Now, I know how loud it gets when you're really listening, and how dangerous it can be when the only footsteps you hear aren't your own. I took a solo camping trip in late September of 2021, up near a lake called Rockmere in northern Maine. I was 34 at the time, working remotely as a freelance designer, and had been feeling burnt out from a string of tight deadlines. The idea was to spend 4 or 5 days away from everything, no phone, no laptop, no emails. Just me, my tent, some food, a fishing rod, and the sound of the woods. I'd done solo trips before, but never this far north and never this remote. I picked Rockmere because it was off the beaten path. No campsites, no marked trails, just forest, water, and silence. It wasn't on many maps, and I had to dig around a few old hiking forums to find directions to a logging road that would take me close enough to hike in. I parked my Subaru Forester at the end of that road and hiked in just under 3 miles with my pack until I found a small clearing on the eastern edge of the lake. It was perfect. The clearing was flat, soft with pine needles, and about 30 yards from the water. I could see the lake through the trees and hear it when the wind blew. I pitched my tent, got a small fire going with the wood I'd brought, and sat back in my camping chair just listening to the breeze. The air smelled like cold dirt and moss, and it was quiet in a way I hadn't felt in months. Felt like exactly what I needed. That first night, I slept like a rock. I woke up a little stiff from the ground, but refreshed. I spent most of the next day fishing at the edge of the lake. I caught a few smallmouth bass, nothing big, but it was fun. I cleaned one and cooked it over the fire for lunch. I didn't see anyone or even hear anything besides birds and the occasional splash of a fish jumping. It was just me and the trees. I felt calmer than I had in a long time. The second night, it got colder. I bundled up inside my sleeping bag and still felt the chill biting at my nose. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to what I thought was the sound of footsteps. I froze, laying completely still, listening. It didn't happen again. Could have been a deer or even a porcupine. I had food sealed in a bear canister 20 feet from my tent, and I wasn't cooking inside. I told myself it was nothing and went back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and checked the area. I didn't see any prints or signs of animals. I figured I must have imagined the noise or misheard it in the wind. I spent that day hiking along the lake's edge. There was no trail, so I just followed the shoreline. I brought a small day pack with water and a snack and wandered for maybe 2 hours out, then turned around. The woods were thick in places, but manageable. I saw a few beaver dams, heard a loon out on the water, and came across what looked like an old trapper's shack, long abandoned. The wood had caved in, and moss covered the roof. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. When I got back to my camp in the late afternoon, something felt off. I couldn't say what exactly, just a slight unease. Everything looked the same. Nothing had been moved or taken, but I still had that weird tension in my chest, like when someone stands behind you in a quiet room. I shook it off, made dinner, and watched the sun go down behind the trees. That night, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were more distinct. Not the scuffling of an animal, but measured steps, slow and spaced out. I sat up inside the tent, heart thudding, and listened hard. They were coming from the direction of the trees behind my tent, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. Then they stopped. I held my breath, not daring to make a sound. I waited for what felt like 10 minutes. Nothing. I didn't hear them move again. I didn't sleep much after that. At first light, I got out and looked around. The pine needles and soft soil made it hard to spot prints, but I did notice a few places where the ground looked compressed, like someone had stepped there recently. It wasn't much, but it was enough to set me on edge. I told myself again it could have been a deer or even a bear, but it hadn't sounded like that. Still, I didn't want to panic. I come out here to relax, to disconnect. Maybe I was just letting my mind wander too far without the usual distractions. I took a deep breath, made breakfast, and tried to push it aside. But later that day, as I was gathering more wood for the fire from deeper in the woods, I found something that stopped me cold. About a quarter mile from my camp, down near a dry creek bed, I found what looked like a recent fire pit. Fresh blackened stones in a tight circle, with charred wood that hadn't fully turned to ash. It hadn't rained in days, and this looked recent. Beside the pit were 2 small logs someone had clearly used as seats. They weren't rotted or moss-covered like everything else out here. The bark was clean and scraped where someone had sat. And next to one of the logs, I found a crushed beer can. It was modern, not some old rusted thing from a decade ago. It was a local brand I'd seen in stores back in Bangor. I didn't bring any beer with me. I don't even drink when I camp. Someone else had been out here. Recently, I stood there for a while, just staring at the can, trying to figure out what to do. I hadn't seen anyone. No sounds of ATVs, no other tents or smoke in the air. Whoever had made this fire hadn't wanted to be noticed. Maybe they were just another solo camper like me. But why so close to my spot without saying anything? Why hide? I felt exposed walking back. The trees no longer felt peaceful. I kept looking over my shoulder, hearing twigs snap that may or may not have been real. When I got back to camp, I considered packing up and heading out, but the sun was already dipping low. The hike back to the car would take over an hour, and the idea of doing it in the dark didn't sit well with me either. I decided I'd leave first thing in the morning. That night, I didn't start a fire. I wanted to stay hidden. I ate a protein bar cold and climbed into my tent while there was still some light. I lay there in my sleeping bag, wide awake, ears tuned to every little sound. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, closer than before. They were on the pine needles just behind my tent. Not fast, not running, just slow, deliberate steps. They stopped, then started again, circling slightly. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. I didn't move a muscle. I didn't even unzip my sleeping bag. I just lay there frozen, trying to breathe as quietly as possible. Then I heard another sound. Something brushed against the side of my tent. Like a finger? A stick? I didn't know. Just a soft, dragging touch. I waited. Then it was gone. No more steps. No more sounds. I don't think I slept at all after that. At first light, I was up and moving. I broke camp fast. Didn't bother to eat. Didn't even fully pack everything properly. Just stuffed it in my pack and started hiking. The trail out felt longer than I remembered. Every snapping branch made me jump. I kept expecting to turn and see someone standing behind me, but I never did. I reached the car a little after 7 a.m., threw my pack in the back, and got out of there. On the way down the logging road, I kept checking the rearview mirror. I didn't calm down until I hit paved roads an hour later. I drove straight to a motel and took a shower that lasted half an hour. I kept thinking about the footsteps, the beer can, the fire pit, the touch on the tent. The next day, I called the local forest ranger office. I didn't tell them everything, just that I'd seen signs of recent campsites near Rockmere and thought they should know in case there were illegal hunters or squatters. The guy on the phone said they rarely got people that deep and thanked me for the heads up. That was it. I haven't been back to Rockmere since. That trip changed the way I look at solo camping. I still go sometimes, but only to places with marked trails, other campers, and some degree of cell signal. I carry bear spray now too, not just for animals. What scared me the most wasn't what I saw, but what I didn't. Someone was out there, close enough to find me, close enough to touch my tent, and they didn't say a word. They didn't make themselves known. They didn't ask for help or announce themselves like a normal person would. They just watched, and that's what stays with me. The quiet watching, the choice to stay hidden. Whoever they were, they weren't out there for the peace and quiet. Not like I was, and that's why I left. Because even in the silence of the woods, some people aren't there to be alone. They're there for something else entirely. I I remember the trip clearly, though it was years ago now. It was the summer of 2017. I was 28, trying to escape the city for a few days, craving some quiet and fresh air. I didn't want a fancy resort or a crowded park, just me and the woods. So, I packed my gear and headed for the national forest near the small town of Pine Ridge, a place I'd heard about from a few friends but never visited. The drive itself was long, winding through narrow roads flanked by tall pines and occasional patches of farmland. The sun was already dipping low by the time I reached the trailhead. The air smelled clean, mixed with pine and earth, the kind of smell city life kills with smog and noise. I parked my old pickup truck in the lot, grabbed my backpack and gear, and started on foot. The trail wasn't difficult. It was well marked but not overly traveled, with the soft crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional bird call breaking the silence. I walked for about 2 hours, deeper into the forest, before finding a spot I liked near a small stream. The ground was flat there, surrounded by thick trees, but enough open sky to see the stars at night, perfect for setting up camp. I unloaded my gear, tent, sleeping bag, stove, and food, and set up camp quickly before dark. The stream babbled softly nearby, and I filled my water bottle from it after filtering the water carefully. The day had been warm, but as soon as the sun disappeared behind the trees, the temperature dropped. I put on an extra layer and built a small fire. The warmth felt good against the cool night air. As the fire crackled, I ate some canned beans heated on the stove and sipped on some water. I liked the quiet, the peaceful isolation. No cell phone signal, no distractions, just the sounds of the forest at night. The stars overhead seemed so bright, and the moon cast pale light through the branches. After I finished eating, I cleaned up and tucked everything away safely, making sure to hang food high in a tree to keep it away from animals. I crawled into my tent and zipped it closed. The tent was small but sturdy, enough to keep out bugs and the chill. The first night passed quietly, with only the occasional rustling of leaves and distant calls of animals. I slept fitfully but well enough, waking a few times to the sound of the stream and the wind brushing through the pines. The next morning, I woke early to the soft light filtering in through the tent. I stretched and stepped outside, breathing deeply. The forest was alive with morning sounds. Birds chirping, squirrels darting up trees, insects buzzing near the wildflowers. I made a simple breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee from my small camp stove. I didn't plan to rush the trip, just days to relax, hike a bit, and enjoy being away from everything. After breakfast, I decided to explore a little farther. I packed a small day bag with water, some snacks, and a map I'd printed from a ranger's website before I left. The trail I planned to follow was marked as moderate difficulty, winding through thick woods and ending at a small ridge with a view of the valley below. The forest grew denser as I walked. Tall firs and spruces towered overhead, their needles creating a soft green light filtering down to the forest floor. The air smelled fresher here, moist and piney. I followed the narrow dirt path, careful of roots and loose rocks. Every so often, I saw signs of animals. Tracks in the mud, scratches on tree bark, piles of scat. About halfway along the trail, the stream I had camped near joined with a larger creek. The sound of flowing water was louder now, rushing over rocks and fallen branches. I stopped for a moment to rest and drink from my bottle, then continued uphill. The climb was steeper now, and the path less clear in places. I had to be careful where I stepped, balancing on loose stones and weaving between thick underbrush. My legs burned with effort, but the thought of the view at the top kept me going. After about 2 hours, I reached the ridge. The trees opened up, and I stepped out onto a rocky ledge. The valley below stretched wide and green, a patchwork of fields, rivers, and forest. The sky was bright blue with a few wispy clouds. It was breathtaking. I sat down on a flat rock, taking in the scene, letting the breeze cool my sweat. The peacefulness was overwhelming. For a moment, I felt like I could stay there forever. Then I noticed something. Across the valley, far off but clear in the sunlight, I saw a thin column of smoke rising from the trees. It wasn't far from where I camped, maybe a couple of miles. At first, I thought it might be a campfire or a small controlled burn, but the smoke was thick and dark. That didn't feel right. I debated what to do. I wasn't sure if I should go back or try to get closer to see what was happening. The smoke looked like trouble. Still, I didn't want to panic or rush. I took out my phone to try to get a signal. Nothing. No bars at all. Just as I expected, the forest blocked it. I decided to head back slowly and keep an eye on the smoke. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe someone else was camping nearby and had a fire going out of control. The hike back down was quicker, but my mind wasn't at ease. The smoke seemed to get thicker. The wind was shifting, blowing the smell of burning wood toward me. When I got close to my camp, I could smell it clearly, smoke and something else, something acrid and sharp. I hurried to my site, my heart beating faster. The fire I'd built the night before was still smoldering, but that wasn't the source of the smoke. Looking up the stream, I saw the flames. They licked the dry grass and low bushes not far from the water's edge. A small patch of the forest was on fire. Panic hit me. I grabbed my water bottle and tried to pour water on the flames, but it barely made a dent. The fire was growing fast, fed by the dry undergrowth and the wind pushing it uphill. I realized I needed to move away, fast. The fire could spread quickly in this forest, and I wasn't prepared to fight it. I grabbed my bag and gear, tossed them into my truck as quickly as I could. The smoke was thick now, making it hard to breathe, my eyes burning. I started the engine and pulled out onto the road just as the fire blazed further, the orange flames bright against the darkening sky. I called the emergency number as soon as I had signal again, explaining where I was and what I saw. They told me help was on the way and warned me to stay clear of the fire. I drove out of the forest as fast as I could, the road twisting through thick smoke clouds and fallen branches. The whole area felt tense, like something dangerous had been unleashed. When I reached the ranger station, they were already coordinating firefighters and evacuation plans. The fire had spread much faster than anyone expected. I stayed there the rest of the night, watching the teams work through the dark, their trucks flashing lights as they battled the flames. The next day, I learned that the fire had burned nearly 1,000 acres before being contained. They never found a clear cause, but the most likely explanation was a careless camper's fire or a cigarette left burning. I felt shaken. I'd been lucky to get out when I did. The forest I loved was scarred, trees and wildlife lost. It made me think about how fragile nature really is, how easily things can go wrong, even with the best intentions. After that trip, I never took camping lightly again. I learned more about fire safety, carried better gear, and always made sure my campfires were fully out. The forest still calls me back, but I respect it now more than ever. I was 34 the year I stayed at the cabin. It was the spring of 2019, late April, just when the days start getting longer but the nights still hold on to that last bit of winter. I'd just gone through a breakup that dragged on for months. My ex and I had shared an apartment in Tacoma, Washington. After she moved out, the place felt empty and loud in weird ways, like the echo of everything we were supposed to be still bounced off the walls. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus at work. I needed a break from everything, so I took some time off, just a week, and booked this old cabin in a part of northern Idaho I'd never been to before, near a lake called Flat Rock, a couple miles from a town named Dunsmuir. Never heard of it, which made it perfect. The cabin was owned by some guy who listed it online as a solitude escape for hunters, writers, and those who need silence. That's what drew me to it, the promise of silence. The pictures showed an old wooden place tucked back into the pines, with a porch and a small dock down a short slope. No other houses in view, just the trees, the water, and this single road winding through the woods to the property. I got there on a Monday afternoon after a 6-hour drive. The last half hour was all narrow gravel roads, dust kicking up behind my car and pine branches scraping against the side mirrors. It was beautiful in the way wild places are, uncontrolled and indifferent to your presence. The kind of place where you could vanish and no one would know for a while. When I pulled up, the cabin looked exactly like the pictures. Weathered wood siding, dark green trim around the windows, and a crooked little porch with 2 rusted chairs and a cooler that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. I parked beside the tree line and just stood there for a while, listening. It was quiet in a way you only find far from people. No hum of traffic, no planes overhead, just the wind and birds and the creak of trees leaning into each other. The inside of the cabin was basic. 1 main room with a bed, a table, a small couch, and a wood-burning stove. There was a tiny kitchen along the back wall and a narrow door leading to a bathroom that smelled like pine cleaner and old pipes. No TV, no Wi-Fi, no cell service either. The owner had left a laminated sheet explaining how to use the generator out back if the solar battery ever ran low. I flipped a few switches, turned on the water pump, and started unpacking. The first 2 days were peaceful. I read, wrote in a notebook, went down to the lake to skip rocks or just sit on the dock with my feet dangling above the water. I cooked simple meals, made coffee in the mornings, and listened to the sounds around the cabin. Birds, squirrels, the crack of branches now and then. There were some deer that came through the clearing one evening. I watched them from the window and felt more settled than I had in months. It was on the 3rd night that something changed. It started with the sounds. I woke up just after midnight. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was steady. A soft crunching of leaves and twigs, slow and deliberate, like someone walking around the cabin. I lay still in the dark, heart beating a little faster. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a bear or a coyote, but I didn't hear sniffing or snorting, just careful footsteps circling the building. I got out of bed slowly, not turning on any lights. I didn't want whoever or whatever it was to know I was awake. I moved to the window and pulled the curtain back just an inch. It was dark out. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the trees were thick around the property. I couldn't see anyone, but the sound kept going. Crunch, pause, crunch. It circled around to the back of the cabin and stopped near the kitchen. There was a long silence then. No movement, no wind. I stood there, frozen, listening so hard my ears rang. Then something brushed against the back wall of the cabin, something heavy enough to make the wood creak. I stepped back from the window and grabbed the flashlight I'd left on the table earlier. I waited 5-10 minutes. No more sounds. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. I looked for tracks but didn't see anything clear. The ground was mostly pine needles and moss, hard to read. No trash disturbed, no marks on the windows or doors. I kept telling myself it was an animal, maybe even my imagination. Stress and isolation can mess with you, but that night it happened again. This time I stayed up, waiting. I left the lights off, flashlight in hand, sitting on the couch with a blanket around me. Around 12:30, the sound started again. The same slow footsteps, same pattern. This time they didn't stop at the back. They came up onto the porch. The wooden boards creaked under the weight. I could hear the long groan of old nails shifting. I didn't move. I just stared at the door, heart hammering. I was sure someone was out there. Person. I could feel it. Then something tapped the door. Not hard, just one slow tap. And then nothing. I waited almost an hour before moving. I didn't go to the door. I didn't open it. I just sat there, every muscle tense, every sound amplified. I slept for maybe 2 hours after sunrise, then packed up half my stuff and threw it in the car. I almost left. I wanted to, but something about it didn't make sense. If someone was messing with me, why? I hadn't told anyone where I was going. I hadn't posted about it. The place was remote. You'd have to know it was there to even find it. It didn't feel random. It felt deliberate. I walked the perimeter again. This time I found something. Behind the cabin, in the space between 2 trees, I saw what looked like a broken branch at first. But it wasn't broken. It had been cut, clean, about waist height, and below it, in the dirt, a shoe print. Not an animal. A boot. Large, maybe size 11 or 12. Deep enough to be fresh. I followed the direction it pointed for a few yards, but it disappeared into the underbrush. I went back inside and locked everything up. I moved the couch in front of the door and kept the flashlight and a knife from the kitchen beside the bed that night. I didn't sleep. The third night was worse. It started later, closer to 2 a.m., same pattern. Footsteps, movement around the cabin. This time, the back door handle jiggled. Just once. Then the window on the left side of the cabin, closest to the bed, tapped once, twice. Then silence. I stayed in bed, eyes wide open, knife clutched in my hand. I didn't move until daylight. As soon as the sun was up, I walked to the road where the car was parked and started it. I was going to leave. I had to. But when I got to the driver's side, I saw the tires. All 4 of them were flat, slashed, clean cuts, same angle on each one. Someone had done it with a blade. I stood there for a while, looking up the road, into the trees and back toward the cabin. I wasn't just being messed with. Someone didn't want me to leave. I checked the car again. The engine started fine. Nothing under the hood was messed with. But without tires, I wasn't going anywhere. The nearest town was 14 miles away. The road wasn't one I wanted to walk alone. I spent the rest of the day inside the cabin. I didn't eat. I barely drank anything. I kept watch from the window, scanning the woods for movement. I thought about trying to climb a tree and wait until night passed. I thought about running and not stopping. But fear kept me there. The kind that paralyzes, that wraps around your spine and tightens. That night, I turned off all the lights, unplugged everything that made noise, and sat with my back against the wall, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. I waited. The footsteps came earlier this time, just past 11. They came fast, no slow circling. Whoever it was moved straight to the front porch. I heard the boards creak again, heard something heavy drop, like a backpack or sack. Then the door shook, not just a tap. Someone yanked on the handle hard. Then again, the couch shuddered in place. Then silence. I held my breath, listening. The window shattered, came from the back of the cabin. The sound was sharp and clean. I turned and saw the glass glinting on the floor, the cold air rushing in. I ran, out the front, past the porch, down the slope toward the lake. I didn't look back. I just ran until my legs gave out. I ended up under the dock, curled in the mud, knife still in my hand. I stayed there all night. I didn't sleep. I watched the trees, the path, the cabin lit faintly by moonlight. I didn't see anyone come out. When the sun rose, I crept back to the cabin. The front door was wide open. Inside, everything was torn up, not destroyed, searched. The drawers were pulled out, my bags dumped, the bed flipped. Whoever it was, they were looking for something, but they hadn't taken anything. Not the little cash I had, not my watch, not the laptop, just looked and left. I walked out to the car, still flat. I grabbed my pack and started walking. I made it to the highway by sunset, waving down a truck driver who radioed for help. The local police came. I rented a small cabin in northern Minnesota in September 2018. I was 31 at the time and had just gone through a long stretch of work without a break. I wasn't burned out exactly, but I felt this tightness in my head that wouldn't go away. Like my brain couldn't slow down. I didn't want to go somewhere with people or distractions, so I found this listing online for a remote off-grid cabin next to a lake. No phone service, no internet, just a generator and a wood stove. It seemed perfect. The owner gave me directions through email, no address, just a hand-drawn map and written instructions. It was about 2 hours from the nearest town. I packed a cooler with enough food for a week, filled the truck with gas, and drove up alone. The last hour of the drive was on gravel roads, winding through thick forest. I didn't pass a single car after leaving the highway. The cabin sat near a small lake called Pine Glass Lake. It was tucked back about 100 yards from the water, surrounded by trees, mostly birch and pine. It was a simple structure, made of weathered cedar with a green metal roof. There was a fire pit out front, a stack of firewood under a tarp, and a narrow path that led to a rickety dock on the water. No neighbors in sight, no boat sounds, just wind and birds. Inside, it was one room, a wood stove in one corner, a twin bed against the back wall, a small table and 2 chairs by the only window, and a propane stove for cooking. There was a composting toilet in a shed about 20 feet behind the cabin. The place was basic, but it was clean. No electricity unless I ran the generator, which I planned to use only for short periods at night. I brought books, a journal, and a small solar-powered radio for news and weather. I didn't bring a gun, just a knife and a hatchet. The first 2 days were peaceful. I fished from the dock, wrote in my journal, cooked simple meals, and listened to loons in the distance. The nights were darker than I was used to, but I liked that. I'd sit outside in the cold, wrapped in a blanket, watching stars and listening to the wind move through the trees. It was the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. On the third day, I woke up around 5:30 a.m. to a strange feeling. Not a sound exactly, but the sense that something had changed. The air felt heavier, stiller. When I stepped outside, there was a faint smell in the air. Something musky. Not smoke, but something off. I looked around and didn't see anything unusual. The woods looked the same. I checked the generator off, checked the door locked. I chalked it up to being in an unfamiliar place and tried to shake it. That afternoon, I took the trail that looped around the lake. It wasn't marked well, just a narrow dirt path worn into the ground. I walked for maybe 3 hours, moving slow, taking in the trees and the smell of pine needles. About halfway around, I saw an old deer stand, rusted and half collapsed, nailed into a tree. It looked abandoned for years. A little further, I found a pile of animal bones. Not fresh, but not completely bleached either. Scattered, like something had dragged them there. Could have been coyotes or even a bear. Still, it made me uneasy. Back at the cabin that evening, I was cleaning a pan outside when I noticed a set of boot prints in the dirt near the corner of the cabin. Not mine. I wear size 11 hiking boots with a distinct tread. These were narrower, smaller, and had a different pattern. It had rained the night before, so the prints were fresh. I stared at them for a long time, trying to figure out how someone could have gotten here. I hadn't heard a vehicle. No neighbors nearby. The trail to the cabin was overgrown and hard to spot even in daylight. I walked the perimeter of the cabin and found nothing else. No trash, no signs of a camp. Just those footprints near the corner. I covered them with a piece of plywood from under the cabin and brought the axe inside with me that night. Sleep didn't come easy. Every sound made me flinch. I kept thinking about those prints. Who had been out here? A hiker? A hunter? Someone passing through? But there wasn't a marked trail close by. I kept going over the map in my head. It didn't add up. Around 3 a.m., I woke to a noise outside. A soft crack, like a twig snapping underfoot. Then another, closer. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. I didn't turn on the lantern. I just sat there in the dark, trying to listen. The sound didn't repeat. No breathing, no footsteps. Just silence again. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked for tracks. But the ground was dry and covered in leaves. If there had been someone, they hadn't left any new signs. I kept telling myself maybe it was a deer or a raccoon. But I knew the sound of a large footstep. It wasn't small. I didn't go far that day. I stayed near the cabin, kept my knife on me, and checked the treeline every few minutes. I started noticing how exposed the cabin was. Windows facing the woods, only one door, no lock strong enough to keep someone determined out. I realized I hadn't told anyone exactly where I was, just the general area. No one would know if something happened. That night, I ran the generator for 15 minutes to charge my flashlight batteries. I didn't use the light much, though. I sat inside with the stove burning, staring at the walls. Around 11 p.m., I heard something again. This time a thud came from behind the cabin. Not a knock, not a branch falling. A flat, dull thud, like someone leaning or bumping against the wood. I froze. Then I grabbed the flashlight and stood by the window, not shining it out yet. I waited for movement. 30 seconds passed. Then I slowly cracked the door and shone the beam behind the cabin. Nothing. I stepped out, heart racing, light scanning the trees. I walked around the back. No one. But something had been there. There was a long scuff mark on the lower part of the wall. Not a boot print. More like someone had leaned hard against it and slid slightly. I didn't sleep at all that night. At first light, I packed my cooler, strapped it shut, and put it in the truck. I didn't leave yet. I told myself I had 2 more nights, and I wasn't going to cut the trip short just because I felt scared. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It wasn't just fear, it was dread. Like I was being watched. Not every second, but off and on. Like whoever it was had a rhythm, checking in from the woods, waiting. Around noon, I heard a vehicle engine. Faint but there. I walked up the trail to the main road and waited. A dusty white pickup passed slowly. No plates on the front. Driver wore a hat, sunglasses. He didn't wave, just stared ahead and kept driving. I turned and walked back, faster than I meant to. I couldn't shake the idea that it was connected, that whoever had been outside the cabin had come back to look again. That night, I didn't light the stove. I kept the cabin dark and quiet. I sat on the bed with the axe across my lap, facing the door. The window had no curtains, so I moved the table in front of it and leaned the mattress upright as a barrier. I stayed like that for hours. At 2:17 a.m., I heard slow footsteps on the leaves outside. Not an animal. Measured human steps. I held my breath. The steps circled the cabin, deliberate and unhurried. Then they stopped. I waited. The night pressed in so heavy I thought my chest would crack. Then the doorknob jiggled. Just once. I gripped the axe and stood up. Whoever it was didn't knock, didn't speak, didn't try again. Just silence. I stayed standing for another hour, staring at the door, waiting for the sound to return. It never did. At sunrise, I left. I didn't make coffee, didn't even brush my teeth. I got in the truck, turned it around fast, and drove hard down that gravel road. I kept checking the rearview mirror the whole time, expecting to see that white truck, but I never did. I reported it to the local sheriff's office when I got back to town. They took a report but didn't seem too interested. Said maybe it was a poacher or some squatter passing through. They didn't send anyone out. Said it was too remote. A week later, I checked the listing online again. Curious. It was gone. No trace. The owner never responded to my follow-up emails. I still think about that trip. Not every day, but enough. The way it felt, the shift in the air, the scuffed wall, the slow footsteps, the hand on the doorknob. There was no ghost, no monster, just a person out there in the dark, watching, waiting, and they knew I was alone. I haven't been back to the woods since. I was 32 when I decided to take a week off and stay alone in a cabin I found online. It was September of 2022, and I had been working nonstop for months at a manufacturing plant outside of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The long shifts, night work, and rotating schedules were draining everything out of me. I needed something quieter, far away from any buzz of machines, alarms, or foot traffic. Just space, air, trees, and no one else. The place I booked was about 4 hours north, near a small town called Ridge Hollow. It wasn't the kind of spot people drove through unless they were headed somewhere deeper into the state forests. The cabin was listed by an older man named Craig who ran a few rentals out that way. It sat on 20 acres of wooded land, backed by a shallow creek and surrounded by uneven, rocky forest terrain. There was no cell reception, but there was a landline for emergencies. The place ran off propane and solar power, and there was a backup generator in a shed out back. I liked that. It meant I could still have light, a stove, and hot water, but no distractions. I packed food, clothes, some tools, 2 knives, my .22 rifle, and a bunch of firewood since the nights were starting to get cold. I didn't plan on hiking much. I just wanted to read, write, sit on the porch, and maybe fish at the creek if I felt like it. I got to the cabin just after noon on a Monday. The sky was clear, blue with high white clouds, and the trees were just starting to shift color. Deep green giving way to yellow and a few touches of red. The cabin looked older in person than it did in the photos. The porch sagged a little on one side, and the roof shingles were curled at the edges, but it was sturdy. It smelled like pine, dried smoke, and age. There was a dusty wood stove inside, a worn couch, and a narrow kitchen with a small gas fridge and stove. The bedroom had one window that overlooked the trees, and the bathroom was tiny, but it had hot water and pressure. I liked it right away. That first day, I just unpacked and sat out on the porch for hours, listening to the wind move through the trees. There were birds calling, distant rustling sounds, and the occasional thump of something falling deeper in the forest. Maybe a branch or a squirrel knocking something loose. Nothing unusual. I had dinner just before sunset. Some canned stew heated on the stove, then read until dark and went to bed. It was quiet that night. So quiet I woke up a few times because of how silent everything was. No cars, no buzz from power lines, not even wind. Just the sound of my own breathing. The kind of quiet that makes your thoughts louder. The next morning I walked down to the creek. It was maybe a 10-minute walk behind the cabin, downhill a little and covered with thick brush. The creek was wider than I expected, about 15 feet across in most places, and only a few feet deep. The water was clear and slow. I saw trout moving under the rocks, fast little flashes of silver that vanished the moment I stepped closer. There was a log across one bend that looked like it had been there for years, gray and water-worn. I sat there for a while just watching. There were no trails, no footprints, no trash. Nothing that said anyone had been through here in a long time. I liked that. Back at the cabin that afternoon, I chopped some kindling, checked the backup generator just to be sure it worked. It started on the second pull, then spent the evening reading again. I lit the wood stove after the sun dipped behind the ridge. The cabin held heat better than I expected. The air inside got thick and comfortable, and I drifted off on the couch for a little before going to bed properly. Sometime during the night, I heard something outside. A short, heavy thud. Not close, but clear. I woke up, lay still, and listened. Nothing followed it. Just stillness again. I didn't feel nervous, just alert. Could have been a deer, maybe a fallen branch. But when you're not used to being that far from people, every sound hits different. I waited, listened, then went back to sleep. The next morning, I walked around the perimeter of the cabin just to look. I didn't find anything out of place. No tracks, no disturbed brush, nothing odd. I went back down to the creek again after breakfast. I brought my rod and tried fishing, but didn't catch anything. I saw something across the water, though, about 30 yards off beyond the trees. A dark shape, big enough to be a person, but it was far and partially blocked by trunks. It wasn't moving. I blinked, looked again, and it was gone. Probably a tree or a stump, but it made me uneasy. That night, I lit the fire again and read longer. I kept hearing things, not big sounds, just slight ones, like snapping twigs, a faint scuffle on the porch, maybe even a breath on the other side of the window. But every time I looked, there was nothing. I told myself it was animals, a raccoon, maybe a fox, but I loaded the .22 and left it by the door just in case. I didn't sleep great that night. The next morning, I found footprints behind the cabin. Human ones, barefoot. They weren't mine. I hadn't been out without shoes, and these were fresh, pressed into the mud near the water tank runoff. They looked small, almost child-sized, but wide. Like the person who made them had a strange gait or was missing toes. There were only a few steps, leading from the tree line toward the back wall, then away again. I stood there for a long time, just staring at them. I felt a tightness in my chest. Not fear exactly, just that cold recognition that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I followed the direction the prints came from but lost them after about 20 feet. The ground was harder there. I didn't want to go too far from the cabin, so I went back and cleaned up the area, brushed the prints away with a branch. I didn't want to keep looking at them. That afternoon, I stayed inside. I didn't light the fire. I didn't open the windows. I sat with the rifle across my lap and tried to read, but I kept glancing at the door. The silence was different now, heavy. I started noticing little things, like how the woods went completely still around 4 p.m. No bird calls, no wind, no distant rustling, just a blanket of silence. It stayed that way until almost dark. Then the sounds came back all at once, like someone flipped a switch. I didn't know what that meant, but it didn't feel right. That night, I heard movement again, closer this time, a scraping sound under the porch. Then footsteps, slow, careful ones, on the gravel path that led around the side. I sat in the dark, holding my breath, rifle ready. I didn't move to the window. I didn't want whoever it was to see any shift of light or shadow. The footsteps stopped. A long pause, then nothing. No sound of retreat, just gone. I didn't sleep at all. I waited until morning, then stepped outside with the rifle and checked everything again. No prints this time, but the doorknob on the shed was smeared with something. Mud, I thought at first, but when I looked closer, it had streaks of red. It wasn't blood. Smelled sour like old meat or spoiled milk. I didn't touch it. I left it and went back inside. I decided then I was done. I couldn't prove someone was messing with me, but my instincts told me I needed to go. I packed everything by noon, locked up the cabin, and drove back toward town. I didn't call the owner. I didn't leave a note. I just left. Back home, I had trouble sleeping for a few weeks. I kept waking up thinking I heard footsteps outside. I kept checking my doors, but nothing happened. Slowly, things went back to normal. 3 months later, I was at a used bookstore and found a local guidebook about the Ridge Hollow area. It had a section on land disputes from the early 2000s. There was a lawsuit about property lines and a brief note about an old trailer community that had been cleared out for environmental reasons. One line stood out, asterisk, the last known occupant was a man named Miles Jerkin, who reportedly refused to leave. The location of his camp was never confirmed, but sightings of a barefoot man in the woods continued for several years. Asterisk. I shut the book and left without buying anything. I haven't gone back to the woods since. I don't think I ever will. There are places that look empty, but they're not. Sometimes something's still there. Not a ghost or a monster, just a person who's been there too long. Someone who learned how to move without being seen. Someone who lives in the silence and watches anyone who steps into it. I was lucky. I left before he didn't want me to. The summer I turned 27, I decided to take a break from my usual hectic schedule in the city. My name is Aaron, and I work in digital marketing. It was a quiet field, but the pressure and long hours were wearing on me. I had gotten so used to the constant buzz of emails, calls, and projects that I was starting to feel like I was on the edge of a breakdown. So, when I saw an ad for a remote cabin rental near the small town of Cherryville, I thought it would be a good chance to disconnect for a while and clear my head. The cabin was in a place called Pine Ridge, nestled deep in the woods, about a 5-hour drive from the city. It was the perfect escape, or so I thought. The first few hours on the road were smooth. The trees along the highway grew thicker the further I went, and the air got crisper. I had my music on, my windows cracked to let in the cool breeze. The sun was setting when I finally turned off the main road and onto a gravel path. The road narrowed, winding between the towering pines, and the further I went, the less I saw of civilization. There were no streetlights, no signs of other houses, just the occasional glimpse of a deer or a rabbit darting through the trees. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked even better than the pictures. It was a small, wooden structure with a wraparound porch and big windows that overlooked a steep hill and a small, clear creek. The place was isolated, sitting at the edge of a dense forest. There was no one else around for miles, not a single neighbor in sight. It was just me, the cabin, and the woods. I unpacked my things quickly, glad to be away from the noise of the city. The cabin had a rustic charm, with wooden beams across the ceiling and a large stone fireplace in the living room. I set up my stuff, grabbed a couple of beers from the fridge, and sat on the porch to watch the sun dip behind the mountains. The air smelled of pine and earth, and everything seemed so peaceful. That first night, I fell asleep easily. The only sound was the occasional crackle of the fire in the living room, the wind rustling through the trees, and the distant call of an owl. I woke up early the next morning, stretched, and stepped outside to get a better look at the surrounding woods. The place felt oddly quiet, almost unnaturally so. I couldn't hear any birds, no insects buzzing, not even the wind in the trees. It was like everything was holding its breath. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just because it was so early. I had come here to relax, after all, not to dwell on things like that. I made breakfast, brewed some coffee, and decided to take a walk down by the creek that ran behind the cabin. The air had a crispness to it that felt refreshing, and the sound of the water rushing over rocks was calming. The forest around me was thick with trees, the ground soft and damp. I followed the creek for a while, admiring the quiet beauty of it all. But the further I walked, the more I began to feel like something wasn't quite right. It wasn't that there was anything specific, nothing overtly strange, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I'd stop, listening intently, but there was nothing. Not a sound, not a movement. I turned back after a while, deciding I had seen enough for the day. The walk had made me feel a little uneasy, though, and I couldn't shake the sense that I was being followed. I tried to tell myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me, but the unease lingered. The rest of the day was peaceful enough. I spent a few hours reading on the porch, then took a short nap in the cabin. By the time evening rolled around, I had forgotten about the weird feeling from the morning. The sun set slowly, casting an orange glow across the cabin and the surrounding forest. I had planned on grilling some steaks on the small barbecue outside, but just as I went to light it, I noticed something odd. There was a dark shape standing at the edge of the tree line, just beyond the clearing where the cabin sat. It was difficult to make out, almost like a shadow blending with the trees, but it was unmistakable. Figure standing still, watching me. I froze, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't move for what felt like forever. My first instinct was to shout, but my throat tightened, and I stayed silent. I wasn't sure if I was just seeing things, so I squinted, trying to get a better look. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, the figure seemed to melt back into the trees. Just like that, it was gone. I thought about it for a while, standing there in the fading light, the chill of the evening creeping in. The logical part of me said it was probably just some animal, maybe a deer or a bear, though I didn't think bears were common in this area. But there was a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the image of that figure, still and silent, just watching me. I decided to stay inside the rest of the night, keeping the lights on and the doors locked. I tried to distract myself with a book, but the nagging feeling wouldn't leave me. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, made my heart race. I didn't sleep well that night. Every noise made me jump. At one point, I thought I heard something outside, moving around the cabin. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, but when I looked out the window, there was nothing there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I decided to go into Cherryville for supplies. I needed to get out of the cabin, clear my head. The drive down the winding road was quiet, and I couldn't help but feel relieved to see a few other people in town. It was small, with only a few shops and a cafe, but it was busy enough to feel like a normal place. I grabbed a few things, including some more food, and talked to a local woman in the shop. She mentioned that the cabin I was staying in had been empty for a while, but didn't say much more than that. I didn't think much of it at the time, but when I returned to the cabin, the sense of unease was back, stronger than ever. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. That night, as I sat on the porch, I heard something, a noise in the woods. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but then it became more distinct. It was a crunching sound, like someone stepping on branches. I stood up, my heart pounding, and looked toward the forest. There, just beyond the tree line, I could make out movement. Figure. This time, I didn't hesitate. I ran inside, locked the door, and sat in the dark, waiting. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I packed up and left. I didn't care about the money I had paid for the cabin, didn't care about anything but getting the hell out of there. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin in the rearview mirror. The place looked the same, but it felt different. Like something was watching me still, even as I left. I never went back to Pine Ridge. The unease never really left me, and even now, all these years later, I still wonder what it was I saw in those woods. Was it just my mind playing tricks, or was someone or something really out there? I don't know, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, and I'll never forget the silence of that cabin, the kind of silence that weighs on you, heavy and suffocating. If you ever find yourself near Pine Ridge, I'd advise you to keep driving. Because some places, no matter how beautiful they seem, are better left undisturbed. The cabin stood in a secluded part of the woods, deep in the mountains of northern Idaho. It was a spot I had stumbled upon through an old travel brochure, one that promised peace and quiet away from the hustle of everyday life. At 27, I needed that space to breathe, to clear my mind. Life had been overwhelming lately, and a solo trip seemed like the perfect way to escape. No distractions, no obligations, just me and the forest. I had arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun began its slow descent behind the tall pines. The air was cool, and the scent of pine needles mixed with the earthy aroma of wet soil. The cabin was older than I had imagined, but sturdy, with thick logs and a stone chimney. The windows were slightly fogged from the inside, and the wooden porch creaked under my weight as I stepped onto it, looking around. It was exactly what I needed: quiet, isolated. It felt like the kind of place where you could lose yourself in nature without anyone around to remind you of the outside world. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust. It was clean enough, though. A single wooden table sat in the middle of the room, with a couple of chairs pushed against it. A stone fireplace stood against one wall, ready for a fire, but it was summer, so I wouldn't need it. There was a small kitchen area with a gas stove, an old fridge that hummed quietly, and a sink with running water. The only other furniture was a worn couch and a thick quilt-covered bed in the far corner of the room. It didn't take long for me to unpack my things. I had brought some food, a few books, and enough supplies to last the few days I planned on staying. I had no particular plans, no agenda. I would hike, fish, read, and just let the time pass slowly. That's all I wanted: peace. The first few hours were exactly as I had imagined. I spent some time sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip lower and the shadows grow long across the forest floor. The sounds of the forest surrounded me: chirping birds, the rustling of leaves, the occasional distant call of an animal. It felt like everything was just as it should be. No interruptions, no noise except nature. As dusk fell, I lit a small lantern in the cabin and started to prepare dinner. The small stove clicked and hissed as the flame caught, and I cooked some pasta, just a simple meal. I wasn't planning on making anything fancy, just enough to fill my stomach. The warmth from the stove was a welcome comfort, and the sound of the boiling water was a calm rhythm. I ate alone, staring out the window, watching the forest darken and become even more still. The night seemed to stretch on forever. The forest outside was quiet now, save for the occasional sound of a twig snapping in the distance. I had read for a while, then decided to turn in early, the fatigue from the day's travel weighing on me. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, with thick blankets that smelled faintly of cedar. I settled in, pulled the blankets up to my chin, and closed my eyes. The first night passed without incident. I woke up early the next morning to the sound of birds chirping outside. The sunlight filtered through the gaps in the wooden blinds, casting a soft, golden glow over the cabin. I stretched, feeling refreshed, and decided to go for a hike. The air was crisp as I stepped outside, and I breathed in deeply, enjoying the scent of pine and fresh earth. There was a small trail nearby, a faint path that seemed to wind through the trees. I grabbed my water bottle and set off, following the trail deeper into the woods. The forest was dense here, the trees towering above, their leaves whispering in the breeze. The path was narrow but clear, and it led me through thick underbrush and patches of wildflowers. I hiked for hours just following the trail as it wound through the trees. I came across a small creek, its water rushing over rocks, creating a peaceful sound that made me pause for a moment. I sat on a rock near the edge, took a sip from my bottle, and watched the water flow. It was easy to lose track of time in a place like this, and I realized I had been hiking for longer than I intended. I had no particular destination in mind, no agenda. The forest was enough. But as I made my way back, I began to notice something strange. The forest, which had felt so alive when I first arrived, now felt different. It was as though the sounds had faded, and the trees seemed to close in on me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about the place felt off. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the air felt heavier, and the silence seemed deeper than it had before. When I finally returned to the cabin, the sun was beginning to dip low again. The woods had taken on an even more somber tone, and the wind had picked up, making the trees sway ominously. I hurried inside, shutting the door behind me and locking it. The feeling of unease didn't go away, but I tried to brush it off. I was just tired, I told myself. I had been hiking alone in unfamiliar woods, and it was natural to feel a bit on edge. I decided to stay in for the rest of the evening. I cooked a simple dinner, just some rice and beans, and ate while sitting at the table. The silence in the cabin was deafening now, almost oppressive. The creaking of the old wood as the house settled was the only sound that broke the quiet. After dinner, I sat in front of the fireplace, staring at the dying embers, lost in thought. The strange feeling hadn't gone away. It lingered, just out of reach, like something was waiting in the shadows. I went to bed early again, determined to get a good night's rest. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept tossing and turning, the unease from the day following me into my dreams. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of movement just outside the cabin, shadows darting between the trees. The wind howled, and the trees seemed to whisper, but it was all just a figment of my imagination, I told myself. But then, in the dead of night, I was jolted awake by a loud bang. It was so sudden, so sharp, that it sent my heart racing. I lay still in the dark, listening intently, but there was no sound, no wind, no movement, just the heavy silence of the cabin. I got out of bed, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and made my way to the door. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if it had just been the house settling. But then I remembered the sound. It had come from outside, a solid, unmistakable bang. My pulse quickened. Slowly, I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, scanning the area with the flashlight. The beam of light swept over the trees, but everything looked calm, peaceful, almost too quiet. I stood there for a moment, the cold air nipping at my skin. The darkness felt thicker now, the trees more imposing. The feeling of unease returned with full force, and I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just outside the cabin. I kept hearing the occasional sound, a branch cracking, a rustle in the underbrush, but when I looked, there was nothing there, just shadows. The following day was different. The sun was bright, and the air had a lightness to it, but the feeling from the night before still lingered. I had planned to spend the day exploring the nearby lake, a small, crystal-clear body of water I had heard about from the brochure. But as I packed my things, I felt a nagging hesitation. Maybe it was just the thought of being out in the woods alone again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. In the end, I decided to stay near the cabin. I spent the day sitting on the porch, watching the trees sway in the wind and trying to ignore the gnawing feeling that something was out of place. As the sun set, the unease in my chest grew, and I locked the door for the night, just as I had the night before. But this time, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, listening, waiting, hoping it was all just my mind playing tricks on me. But it wasn't. Just after midnight, I heard the noise again. A knock, a thud, like something heavy hitting the cabin wall. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. What I saw next made my blood run cold. A figure stood in the trees, barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark silhouette against the night sky. My breath caught in my throat, and I slammed the door shut, my hands shaking as I locked it. For the rest of the night, I didn't sleep. I kept the flashlight on, my eyes darting between the windows, convinced I was being watched. The next morning, I left. I couldn't explain what had happened or why I felt so uneasy, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't staying another night in that cabin. As I packed my things and walked down the porch steps, I looked back one last time. The cabin stood there, silent and still, as if nothing had ever happened. I didn't know what I had seen, or if I had seen anything at all. But as I drove away, I felt a weight lift off. It had been a long drive to get there, about 6 hours, give or take, from the small town where I lived to the cabin deep in the woods. I had rented the place for a week, needing a break from the city, hoping the solitude would help me sort out the mess that had been building up in my life. I didn't really have any expectations except for peace and quiet, maybe a chance to reflect, but as soon as I pulled up, I could feel the air change. The cabin itself was older than I had imagined. The wood was weathered, and the roof had patches where the shingles were missing. It looked like it hadn't been maintained in a long time, but that was fine with me. The more secluded it felt, the better. I grabbed my bags from the trunk of my car and made my way up the small dirt path to the porch. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. It wasn't fear exactly, just the feeling of walking into something old, something that had its own history. I stepped inside, setting my bags down on the floor by the door, and took in my surroundings. The interior was basic: a small kitchen with a stove, a refrigerator, and a sink. A worn-out couch sat against one wall, facing a fireplace. A wooden table in the center of the room, with mismatched chairs around it. The floors creaked under my boots as I moved through the space, and the smell of old wood and dust hung in the air. It was everything I expected, and I could already feel the weight of the world lifting off my shoulders. I dropped my things and made my way to the back of the cabin, where the bedrooms were. The bedroom I chose was small, just enough space for a bed and a dresser. The bed had a thick, quilted blanket on it, and the window overlooked the trees outside. It felt like the perfect place to relax and disconnect from everything. I didn't waste much time unpacking. I was too eager to get settled and enjoy the peace. The first day passed quietly. I spent some time exploring the woods around the cabin, taking in the fresh air and listening to the sounds of nature. I found a small stream nearby, its water gurgling softly over rocks. I sat by it for a while, enjoying the solitude. No phone signal, no distractions, just me and the wild. The kind of peace I hadn't experienced in years. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over everything. I made a simple dinner, ate it while sitting by the fire, and went to bed early, ready to start fresh in the morning. But that's when things started to feel off. It wasn't immediate, but I began to notice small things. The way the trees outside seemed to rustle even when there was no wind. The occasional creaking sound from the walls of the cabin, as if the house itself was breathing. I brushed it off at first, chalking it up to the house settling, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But as the days passed, the feeling grew stronger. At night, I would lie awake in bed, staring out the window into the pitch-black forest. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. On the third day, I decided to go for a hike. There was a trail marked on the map I had found in the cabin, one that led to a small clearing where supposedly there was a good view of the surrounding area. I figured it would be a good way to clear my head. I packed a small bag with water and a few snacks and set out early in the morning. The hike wasn't long, but it was harder than I expected. The path was narrow and overgrown in places, with thick branches and underbrush brushing against my legs. I kept my eyes on the trail, not wanting to trip, and after about an hour of walking, I reached the clearing. It was just as the map described. A small open space with a view of the valley below, the mountains rising in the distance. I took a deep breath, enjoying the peace of the place, but something felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it. It wasn't the view or the quietness, but something in the air, an almost oppressive stillness. No birds, no wind, just the faintest rustling of leaves. It was then that I noticed the footprints. They were fresh, barely visible in the dirt, but unmistakable. Someone had walked through the clearing recently. I knelt down, studying them. They were large, too large to be mine, and the soles of the shoes were heavy, like boots that had been worn for years. Whoever had made them had walked in a straight line, as though they had a purpose. I stood up quickly, my heart rate picking up. I looked around, but the forest was still. No one in sight. I had been on the trail for over an hour, and I hadn't seen another soul. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt a sudden urge to get back to the cabin. The hike back felt longer. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent my pulse racing. By the time I returned, the sky was beginning to darken, and I made sure to lock every door and window before settling in for the night. I was still uneasy, but I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. The next day, I didn't leave the cabin. I spent most of the day inside, reading and trying to distract myself. But the feeling of being watched was ever present. Every time I glanced out the window, the trees seemed to shift, as if they were hiding something. And I couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was out there, just beyond the treeline. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the lights on in the cabin and sat near the window, staring out into the forest. The sound of the wind was gone, replaced by the unsettling silence. And then, around midnight, I heard something. A knock. It was faint at first, almost inaudible, but it came again, louder this time. A sharp, deliberate knock. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't move. The knock came a third time and then silence. My mind raced. Who would be out here in the middle of the night? The nearest neighbor was miles away. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way to the door, peeking through the peephole. Nothing. The porch was empty, but I knew something was off. I felt it deep in my gut. I spent the rest of the night awake, watching and listening. The sounds outside were distant, like someone was walking around the cabin, but whenever I looked out the window, no one was there. By the time morning came, I was exhausted, but I had no choice but to leave. I packed my things quickly, not caring about being organized. I was ready to get out. I grabbed my bags, made sure the cabin was locked, and stepped out into the daylight. The sun was bright, but it didn't feel comforting anymore. I didn't stop to take in the view or enjoy the peace. I drove straight back home, my hands gripping the wheel tight, never looking back. It wasn't until I was back in town, safe and sound, that I realized just how much my mind had been playing tricks on me. I was home, away from the cabin, and the unsettling feeling was gone. But deep down, I couldn't shake the sense that I had narrowly avoided something that might have been watching me the whole time. And I realized then that the cabin wasn't just old. It was waiting. The drive back had cleared my head, but there was still that nagging feeling, the one that wouldn't go away. Maybe it was just the isolation, or maybe it was something else entirely. But I knew one thing for sure. I would never return to that cabin again. I couldn't shake the thought that the woods were meant to stay undisturbed, and I had disturbed them. I was 31 that year, and I had been feeling burned out from everything: work, the city, even the people around me. I lived in a noisy part of Cleveland, and every day felt like it was closing in on me. I needed quiet, distance, and no obligations. So in early October of 2022, I rented a remote cabin in the Adirondacks, just north of Indian Lake, New York. It was a 2-week rental, just me and a backpack full of supplies. I wasn't planning on seeing anyone. I didn't want to. The place was about 5 miles off the nearest paved road, only accessible by a rough gravel track that cut through dense woods and curved around a small ridge. I had to park my car a mile away from the cabin and hike the last bit in. It was isolated, no phone signal, no internet, no power except a small solar panel hooked up to a few lights and a battery for charging small things. It was perfect. The cabin was simple but not falling apart. Wooden walls, metal roof, a little deck facing the trees. Inside was one room with a wood stove, a cot with a thin mattress, shelves stocked with basic cookware and a few old books, and a small bathroom with a composting toilet and a gravity-fed water tank. It was the kind of place where time slows down because there's nothing to mark it except the sun coming up and going down. The first few days were calm. I would wake up early, make coffee on the propane stove, then take walks through the woods. I didn't follow trails. I preferred wandering, stepping carefully between ferns and fallen branches, listening to the wind move through the trees. Sometimes I'd sit by the edge of a creek about half a mile from the cabin and just watch the water. I brought a notebook with me, but I didn't write much, just a few thoughts here and there. The silence did more for me than any words could. By the fourth day, I had settled into a rhythm. I chopped wood in the morning to keep the stove going, read in the afternoons, and took short hikes when the weather allowed. I hadn't seen another person since I left my car. That was the plan, and I liked it that way. But around the fifth night, something small happened that I brushed off at first. I had just finished dinner, boiled rice and canned beans, and stepped outside to stretch. The air was cool and still, and I stood on the deck for a while, breathing it in. The forest was quiet, the way it always is after dark. But then I heard a sound, not loud, just a soft crunch of leaves, coming from the slope behind the cabin. I froze and waited, trying to hear more. It stopped. I figured it was a deer or maybe a fox. It was their home more than mine. The next morning, I went out back to check. I didn't see anything unusual. No prints, no broken branches. So I chalked it up to animals. The days were shorter now, and the nights got colder, so I spent more time inside reading or sitting by the fire. Still, every now and then, I'd hear something at night. A footstep that wasn't mine. A branch snapping too close to the cabin. Not often, but enough to make me start locking the door at night even though I knew no one should be around. On the seventh day, I went for a longer hike. I packed water, a sandwich, and headed southeast through the woods, aiming to circle back in a wide loop. I had marked the cabin's location in my GPS watch just in case, but I didn't plan on getting far. After maybe an hour and a half, I came across something that didn't feel right. It was a small clearing, the kind that looked like it had been cleared a long time ago and then partly reclaimed by the woods. In the center of it was an old metal barrel, rusted, half buried in the ground. Next to it was what looked like the remains of a tarp or plastic sheet, now shredded and stuck under fallen branches. And on one of the trees at the edge of the clearing, I saw a red rope tied around the trunk. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't completely weathered either. It had no obvious purpose. I didn't touch it. The whole place felt wrong. I backed away and went back the way I came. That night, I couldn't sleep well. I kept hearing noises outside, subtle ones. A shuffle of leaves, a faint knock. Once I thought I saw a shadow move past the edge of the window, but I couldn't be sure. I had no neighbors, no other cabins nearby. I reminded myself that I'd probably just spooked myself with the weird clearing and let my imagination run wild. But I started keeping my axe next to the cot, just in case. On day 9, I woke up to find the door unlocked. That scared me more than anything else. I always locked it at night. Always. My hands shook as I checked the cabin. Nothing was missing, nothing broken. But the lock itself hadn't been damaged, it was just turned open. That told me someone had been inside. Someone with hands and the sense to turn a knob, not a wild animal. I didn't know if they were still around. I didn't know if they had been watching me for days. I considered leaving, packing up, and hiking back to my car. But I was stubborn and tried to convince myself it could have been a mistake. Maybe I thought I locked it but didn't. Maybe. I couldn't prove it either way. So I stayed, but I didn't sleep well that night. I kept the lights off and stayed quiet. I sat in a chair by the window for hours, listening. I didn't hear anything that night. That almost made it worse. On day 10, I went out again to check the area. I looked for signs, footprints, any broken twigs, anything unnatural. And I found it. Near the path I normally used to go to the creek, I saw a rope hanging from a branch about 10 feet off the ground. It had a loop tied at the end, nothing large enough for a person, but it didn't belong there. It hadn't been there before. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't touch it. I turned around and went back to the cabin. That was the moment I made the decision to leave early. I packed most of my things that afternoon. I planned to head out the next morning. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I felt exposed. I kept scanning the woods, hoping to see nothing but half expecting something, or someone, to be there. I didn't light a fire that night. I didn't cook anything. I stayed in the dark, waiting for morning. I barely slept. Around 3 a.m., I heard the cabin's floor creak. Just once. The kind of sound that happens when someone shifts their weight slowly. I didn't move. I just stayed still, my axe gripped in my hand under the blanket. I didn't hear anything else after that, just the wind. When the sun finally came up, I didn't waste time. I grabbed my pack, slung it over my shoulder, and left. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't bother sweeping or closing the place properly. I just locked the door and started walking fast down the path toward my car. The hike back felt longer than it had before. I kept looking over my shoulder, checking the tree lean, listening for anything behind me, but nothing came. I reached my car in less than an hour. When I got there, I checked the tires, the trunk, the back seat, everything. It was all untouched. I got in and started the engine. The relief didn't come right away. I kept looking in the rearview mirror as I drove down the gravel road, expecting someone to appear behind me, but the woods stayed quiet. It wasn't until I hit the main road and saw other cars again that I started to feel normal. By the time I made it back to Cleveland, it felt like the whole thing had happened in a dream, except I still had the axe in the passenger seat and the bag packed with the things I didn't use on my last night. I never reported anything. There wasn't anything clear to report. No crime, just a feeling, a sense that someone had been there, watching, waiting, and maybe they didn't like that I was in their space. Or maybe they didn't care at all until they realized I was alone. I don't know, but I haven't been back to the woods since. I still hike sometimes, but never that far out, never that isolated. And I don't stay overnight anymore. That cabin reminded me that people are scarier than anything you can make up in your head. And that sometimes, someone might be out there who doesn't need a reason, just an opportunity. I was 32 when I decided I needed a break from people. It was late October 2018. I was living in a crowded apartment complex in Tucson, Arizona, and the noise and constant pressure of work and city life were starting to grind me down. I just finished a rough project that had stretched on for nearly 6 months, and after turning it in, I told my boss I needed a week off. I didn't want to go to a beach or a hotel or anything like that. I wanted total silence, somewhere far from cell service or traffic or voices. I started looking online for cabins to rent and came across this place just outside a small town called Ouray, Colorado. The cabin was isolated, backed into a thick patch of forest, and sat at the end of a gravel road about 30 minutes from town. It looked worn down in the pictures, not fancy, but sturdy and comfortable enough. The listing said there was no Wi-Fi, no TV, and no cell reception. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed up my car with some food, water, a few changes of clothes, and a couple of books. I left Tucson around 4 in the morning and drove straight through. I got into Ouray around sunset the same day. It was already cold there, colder than I expected. The air was dry and crisp, and snow was dusted across the edges of the road. I filled up on gas, bought a couple of extra things from the local market, and followed the directions the owner had emailed me. The drive to the cabin was quiet. The gravel road was narrow and wound through hills and dense patches of trees. The further I went, the more alone I felt. The sun dipped behind the mountains, and everything turned dark quickly. I had to put my headlights on low and take the last mile or so slowly because the road was uneven, and I kept seeing deer standing in the shadows near the trees. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked smaller than I expected. It sat alone in a clearing surrounded by pine trees, with a small porch and a single light by the front door. I parked near the porch, shut off the engine, and sat in silence for a moment. No sound, not even wind. Felt peaceful but also strange. I told myself I was just not used to that level of quiet. I brought my bags inside and checked the place out. It had one bedroom, a bathroom, a little kitchen, and a living area with a wood-burning stove. Everything smelled like old wood and dust. There was a pile of firewood next to the stove, and I got a fire going right away because it was colder than I expected. I turned on a couple of lamps powered by solar batteries the owner had set up. The light was dim but enough to see by. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a can of soup, read for a little while, and then went to bed. The bed was stiff and creaked whenever I moved, but I was tired and fell asleep quickly. I woke up a few times during the night from the cold. Even with the fire, the temperature in the cabin dropped fast. I got up around 3 in the morning to add more logs to the stove and then went back to sleep. The next morning, I felt rested. I made coffee using a little gas stove in the kitchen, stepped outside, and looked around. The clearing was maybe an acre in size, with a narrow path leading off into the trees behind the cabin. I assumed it was a hiking trail. There were no tire tracks besides my own. No signs of animals or people, just quiet. I spent most of that day reading and walking around the property. The trail behind the cabin went about a quarter mile into the woods and ended at a small stream. I sat there for a while, just listening to the water. It felt good to not think about anything. That night, I made some pasta and read by the stove again. Around 10, I started hearing noises from outside. Not loud, just something faint. It sounded like twigs breaking or footsteps on leaves. I assumed it was a deer or maybe a fox. Still, it made me feel a little uneasy. I didn't have any cell service and there was no landline, so if something went wrong, I'd have to drive all the way back to town. I didn't go outside to check. I stayed in, kept the fire going, and eventually went to sleep. The next day, I found footprints in the dirt near the side of the cabin. They weren't mine. They were a little smaller than my boots, and I had only walked around the front and out back toward the stream. These were on the side, near a small, dusty window. At first, I thought they could be old. Maybe from the owner or someone who came to maintain the place. But I'd walked around that same area the day I arrived, and I hadn't seen any then. I brushed it off, told myself I was overthinking things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been near the cabin during the night. I didn't hike that day. I stayed close, chopped some more firewood, cleaned the kitchen, and tried to keep myself distracted. Every time I stepped outside, I caught myself looking around the treeline, trying to see if someone was out there watching. I saw nothing. No movement, no animals, no people. That night, the noises came back. Louder this time, more deliberate. It didn't sound like random branches breaking. It sounded like footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps walking around the perimeter of the cabin. I sat still by the fire, holding my breath, straining to hear. At one point, the footsteps stopped completely. I stood up, stepped over to the window next to the front door, and looked out. I couldn't see anything, just darkness and trees. Then I heard a sound I can only describe as a slow drag across the side of the cabin, like someone running their hand or a stick across the wood. I backed away from the window, grabbed the fire poker, and stood near the stove in silence. I didn't move for a long time. I didn't hear anything else after that. Eventually, I got into bed with my clothes on and the fire poker on the floor next to me. I left one of the lamps on. The next morning, I went outside and walked the perimeter of the cabin. I found more footprints, clear ones, definitely fresh. They went from the trees to the side of the cabin, then around the back, and then back into the woods. I followed them for a while, maybe 50 feet into the trees, but they just vanished into the underbrush. I went back inside and locked the door. I knew someone had been there, watching, walking around while I was inside. I debated leaving right then, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe a hiker had gotten lost and wandered near the cabin. Maybe they didn't mean anything by it, but still, something about it felt wrong. Like they knew I was inside and were trying to mess with me. That day, I kept all the blinds shut. I stacked a couple of chairs in front of the door just to feel a little safer. I stayed inside and tried to focus on my book, but I couldn't concentrate. That night, it got worse. Around midnight, I heard something at the back window, a soft tapping, repeated, steady. I turned off the lamp, grabbed the fire poker again, and stood quietly near the wall. The tapping stopped. Then I heard something scrape against the window glass. Not hard enough to break it, just enough to be heard. I didn't move. I stood like that for at least an hour. Then came footsteps again, slow, measured, moving from the back window to the side of the cabin. Then nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake until the sky started turning gray. As soon as there was enough light to see, I opened the door and stepped outside. There were new footprints again. I followed them further this time, deeper into the woods behind the cabin. After about 200 feet, I found something that stopped me cold. A dead rabbit. It was lying on a flat rock, placed deliberately. Its neck had been broken, and its stomach was cut open. Flies were already gathering. There were no bite marks like you'd expect from a predator. It looked like someone had killed it and placed it there. I turned around and walked quickly back to the cabin. That was the final straw. I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't even eat breakfast. I shoved my clothes into my bag, doused the fire, and threw everything into the car. I locked the cabin even though it didn't seem like it would matter. As I pulled out of the clearing and got back onto the gravel road, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting someone to step out of the trees and follow me. I didn't stop until I was back in Uray. I pulled into the gas station and sat there for a long time, just breathing. Once I was calm enough, I went inside and told the clerk that I thought someone had been sneaking around the cabin I rented. He didn't seem surprised. He just nodded slowly and said, "Some folks don't like outsiders around here." I didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't want to know. I got back to Tucson late that night. When I emailed the cabin owner the next day to let him know what happened, I never got a reply. I waited a week, then another. Nothing. I never found out who was out there, what they wanted, or why they were stalking that cabin. But I know they were watching me. They knew where the windows were, how to move quietly, and how to leave just enough of a sign to make me afraid. It wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was just a person. A real person doing real things with some dark purpose behind them. That's what scared me the most. I never went back to Colorado after that, and I haven't stayed alone in the woods since. I rented a small cabin in the northern part of Vermont in October 2019. I was 36 at the time, working as a freelance graphic designer, and I had just finished a big project that kept me at my desk for nearly 2 straight months. My back hurt from sitting too long, my eyes burned from screen time, and my sleep was a mess. I needed to get away from everything: my apartment, emails, traffic, neighbors, the city. I just wanted quiet. I found the cabin through a small rental site someone mentioned in a forum. It wasn't on Airbnb or any major platform. The photos were plain, nothing edited. Just 4 wooden walls, a tin roof, a little stove in the corner, and a bed. The guy who owned it said it had running water and basic electricity from a solar rig. No Wi-Fi, no cell signal. That was exactly what I wanted. It sat a few miles from a gravel road near a town called Averill, way up near the Canadian border. I had to drive about 6 hours to get there from where I lived in southern New Hampshire. The last 2 hours were just trees, hills, dirt roads, and occasional signs warning of moose. I passed maybe 2 other cars the whole time after I left the highway. I got there just before sunset on a Thursday. The air smelled cold and sharp, like dry leaves and firewood. The sky was that washed-out blue color it gets in October when the sun's low and the clouds are barely moving. I parked the car about 50 feet from the cabin on a patch of flattened grass that was clearly used for this exact purpose. My boots crunched over dry leaves as I walked to the door. The cabin wasn't anything fancy. The inside smelled like pine and a little like old smoke, like someone had used the wood stove the night before. There was one bed, a narrow one, pushed against the wall. A little shelf with some canned goods and matches. A small table and 1 wooden chair. I brought all my own food, but I left the cans alone in case I needed them. There were 2 windows, one next to the bed and one above the table. Both were single-paned with old wood frames. The glass had bubbles in it and looked like it had been hand-poured. I could see out, but it made everything slightly warped. There wasn't much to unpack, just clothes, a flashlight, some dry food, a small cooler, and a few books. I put them all away and sat outside on a log for a while, listening to the wind. There wasn't a sound except the creaking of branches and the occasional knock of something falling. Maybe an acorn or a pine cone. It was beautiful and more silent than I'd expected. The kind of silence that's thick. You start hearing your own breath, your own heartbeat. After a while, I went back inside, made a simple meal, and sat by the stove until it got dark. That first night was peaceful. The wind picked up and I could hear it brushing over the roof and pushing at the walls. The cabin creaked, but not in a creepy way, just the sound of old wood flexing with the temperature drop. I fell asleep around 10 and woke up once in the middle of the night to complete darkness. I remember looking out the window and not seeing anything. No moon, no stars, just black. I wasn't afraid, just a little uneasy. I guess being that far out alone messes with your brain a bit. The next day I hiked. There were trails nearby, though most weren't marked. Just old paths deer or hunters had used. I followed one that led down a hill and crossed a small stream. The water was freezing, but clear enough to see every rock on the bottom. I sat there for over an hour just watching it. I didn't bring my phone, didn't check the time, didn't even bring a watch. I just wanted to stop thinking. That evening, I chopped some firewood from the pile behind the cabin. There was a stump with an axe buried in it, like something out of a movie. Everything was damp from an earlier rain, so I had to work a bit to get dry wood. But I managed. I had a fire going by dusk and read a book until the light faded. Again, no weird noises, no issues. But that changed the third night. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a sound outside. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't part of the wind or the trees. It was a slow crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. I didn't move at first. I just listened. I knew it could have been an animal. Probably was. Maybe a deer. But the steps were paced out like a person walking. Slow, deliberate. Then they stopped. Completely. Like whoever or whatever was making them realize they were being heard. I sat up in bed and listened harder. I wanted to check, to look out the window, but part of me didn't want to move. I couldn't see much from where I was. Just the ceiling and the glow of dying embers in the stove. My flashlight was within reach, but I didn't turn it on. I stayed still. After a few minutes, I heard the steps again. Only this time they were moving away. Not fast, just a slow, steady retreat. I waited at least 20 minutes before I got up and looked out the window. I didn't see anything, just the trees swaying in the breeze. I told myself it was an animal, probably a bear or maybe a moose. Those things make all kinds of noise and don't care who hears them. Still, I couldn't sleep much after that. Every little creak made me perk up and listen. I stayed in bed until the sun came up. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. There were marks in the leaves, but nothing clear enough to say what made them. No paw prints, no boot prints, just areas where the leaves had been pressed down or disturbed. I walked the tree line a bit and circled the cabin twice, but didn't find anything else. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I read, collected more firewood, and tried to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It's weird how just one sound at the wrong time can change everything. What started as a relaxing trip was now something else. I kept telling myself I was overthinking it, but I couldn't shake it. That night, I set a small trap using a tin cup and some string across the path leading to the cabin. It wouldn't stop anything, but it might make noise if something came close. I also left one of the windows open just slightly so I could hear better. I didn't want to block out the sounds completely. That turned out to be a mistake. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a loud metallic clink. The cup had been knocked over. I sat straight up and grabbed my flashlight. I didn't turn it on. I just waited. Again, the sound of footsteps, this time slower, almost like they were trying not to be heard. They circled the cabin once, twice. Then I heard something scrape lightly against the wall, like a stick or a knife dragged along the wood. I stayed in bed, not moving, heart pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. I didn't want to shine the light through the window because I didn't know if that would make things worse. Whoever was out there, if it was a person, they were messing with me. They weren't trying to break in. They were testing me. The footsteps went quiet again. I waited. 30 minutes passed. An hour. Nothing. Just silence. When the sun rose, I found the tin cup about 10 feet away in the dirt. The string had been snapped, not untied. There were clear shoe prints now, boot prints. Not animal. Human. They were large, probably a man's. They led from the tree line to the cabin, then around it twice, just like I'd heard. Then they disappeared back into the woods. I should have left right then, but I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to feel like I'd been run off. Maybe I thought I could handle it. I told myself it might be a hunter or a local screwing around. But I knew deep down this wasn't some bored kid. This was someone who knew I was alone and was taking their time. That day I didn't hike. I barely ate. I just sat and listened. Every crack of a branch, every gust of wind. I was on edge. When it started to get dark, I locked the door and jammed the chair under the knob. Even though I knew it wouldn't stop much, I kept the fire low and didn't light the lantern. I didn't want to draw attention. That night I didn't sleep. Not even a little. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time they came right up to the window next to the table. I could hear breathing. Not heavy, just soft, steady. It lasted about a minute. Then more slow steps around the cabin. And then the handle on the door clicked. Not turned hard, just touched, tested. I had the axe beside the bed by then. I held it tight and stayed frozen. Eventually the sounds faded. Whoever it was, they left again. When the sun came up, I left. I didn't pack much, just grabbed my bag and threw it in the car. I didn't look around. I didn't take one last look at the cabin. I just drove. I filed a report with the local sheriff's office, but nothing came of it. They said they'd send someone to check it out, but I never heard back. I didn't want to follow up. I just wanted to forget. The strange thing is, nothing actually happened to me. I wasn't attacked. Nothing was stolen. The cabin wasn't broken into, but it was clear someone out there knew I was alone and they were enjoying the game. I think that's what unsettled me the most. Not the noise, not the footsteps, but the patience. Whoever they were, they weren't in a rush. They were watching, waiting, testing me. I never went back to that cabin. I don't go anywhere that remote anymore. Not alone. I still love nature, still go on hikes, but always where I can see people, where my phone works. That trip changed something in me. I still think about those nights. I was 32 when I rented the cabin in northern Idaho. It was late September 2017. I had just finished a long, drawn-out work contract that had completely drained me. I'd been sitting behind a desk, staring at 2 monitors for 12 hours a day for nearly 5 months. The project was finished, the team celebrated, and for once I had nothing waiting for me when I got back home. No work, no meetings, no obligations. I needed a break. Something far away from noise, people, and constant emails. I found the cabin on a small rental site. It wasn't one of the big platforms, just a niche site for outdoorsy rentals. The listing described it as an off-grid log cabin, secluded and peaceful, deep in the Clearwater National Forest. That sounded perfect to me. I didn't care much for luxury or convenience. I wasn't going there to stream shows or eat fancy food. I just wanted to sleep, hike, maybe fish and reset my brain. I booked it for 10 days. It was about a 4-hour drive from Coeur d'Alene, mostly winding through dense woods and climbing into some seriously remote territory. The last 30 miles were gravel, then dirt. I lost cell reception halfway through the dirt road. That didn't bother me. I had planned for it, downloaded maps, packed everything I needed, brought backups of everything. Food, water, batteries, even firewood and gas canisters. The cabin was smaller than I expected. 1 room, a covered porch, a fire pit out front. It was built with thick logs that had darkened from years of sun and weather. There was a creek running behind it, maybe 30 feet away, and beyond that the tree line went on and on like an endless green wall. There were no neighbors, no passing cars, not even aircraft overhead. It was quiet in a way I'd almost forgotten existed. Inside, it had a basic wood stove, a single bed, a small table, and shelves with basic kitchen tools. A few hooks for hanging things. No running water, just a 5-gallon jug and some buckets. An outhouse about 30 yards away, around a bend behind a few trees. There was a hand crank radio and some flashlights in a box, a couple of lanterns, and a few old magazines on the table. The first 3 days were everything I needed. I hiked during the day, cooked simple meals on the wood stove, read one of the paperbacks I brought, and slept like a rock. I woke up with the sun and went to sleep not long after it set. My brain felt like it was slowly turning back on after months of being on autopilot. The sound of the creek, the wind moving through the pines, it was like medicine. On the 4th night, I woke up just past midnight. Something felt wrong. I didn't hear anything unusual at first, but my body was tense. It was like a switch had flipped inside me. I sat up in bed and waited, listening. The fire in the stove had gone down, and the inside of the cabin was cold. I wrapped a blanket around me and went over to the woodpile, feeding a few small logs into the stove. I stood there watching the flames catch, trying to shake the strange feeling in my gut. Then I heard something outside. It wasn't loud, more like a shuffle, a slow movement through dry leaves. I froze. I didn't move a muscle, just stared at the door. The sound came again, this time a little clearer. Something walking on 2 feet. Not a deer, not a bear. Someone. My mouth went dry. I moved slowly to the window. There was no glass, just a shutter I could pull aside. I did it slowly, peeking out. The moon was out, and I could see parts of the clearing in front of the cabin. Nothing. I looked toward the trees near the fire pit. Nothing moved. I waited a full 5 minutes, scanning every shadow. Then I heard it again, closer now. It came from the side of the cabin, the direction of the outhouse. I grabbed the flashlight from the shelf and turned it on, aiming it through the window in that direction. Again, nothing. Just the trees, the slope down to the creek, and the edge of the cabin in shadow. I kept the light there for a long time. Nothing moved. Eventually, I shut the shutter, turned off the light, and sat on the bed. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun came up, I stepped outside and did a slow walk around the cabin. I checked near the fire pit behind the outhouse and even walked a little down toward the creek. I saw nothing. No tracks. No signs anyone had been there. Could have been an animal, I told myself. The forest played tricks on your ears at night. Echoes. Branches falling. Maybe I imagined the footsteps. But I didn't believe that. That day I went on a long hike, trying to clear my head. I climbed one of the nearby ridges and spent a few hours just sitting and looking at the valley. I brought my camp chair, some snacks, and a thermos of coffee. I didn't see or hear anything unusual all day. When I came back to the cabin, the light was slanted and orange. I rebuilt the fire in the stove, made a simple dinner, and sat on the porch watching the sky get dark. I didn't sleep well that night either. I didn't hear anything, but my nerves were on edge. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind made my heart beat faster. I stayed in bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling for hours. The next day, I found something that made my skin crawl. I was walking behind the cabin near the creek, looking for dry branches to use as kindling, when I saw a shape on the other side of the water. It was a boot, just one, a heavy black boot, sitting at the base of a tree. I hadn't noticed it before. I crossed the creek, climbed up the short slope, and picked it up. It was old and worn, but still intact. Inside was a torn sock and a few dead leaves. Nearby, I found a rusted can of beans with holes in it, and a bit farther up, a blue tarp folded beneath a pile of branches. It looked like someone had been camping there at some point, maybe squatting, but I didn't see any other gear. No tent, no bag, no sign of a campfire. It was just the tarp, the boot, and the can. I looked around for any more clues, but the area was clean. It didn't feel recent. The leaves and pine needles covering the tarp looked like they'd been there for a while. Still, it added to the unease. I didn't know if someone had passed through recently or if this was from years ago. Either way, it meant someone had been out here before. Someone had camped less than 100 yards from the cabin without it being in the listing or guest book. That night, I locked the cabin door and slid one of the chairs under the handle. I kept the flashlight on the table next to me, fully charged. The axe was leaned against the bed. I didn't sleep at all. My ears were wide open, every sound making me sit up and hold my breath. Around 3 in the morning, I heard the noise again. This time it was more deliberate. Steps, slow and clear. I reached for the flashlight and aimed it at the door, waiting. The sound stopped. I held my breath. Then it came again, this time from the back of the cabin. I moved to the window facing that direction and cracked the shutter open. There was someone standing at the edge of the trees. Not moving, just standing. Their shape was almost hidden in the dark, but the outline was clear enough. They didn't have a light. They weren't walking. They were just there. I froze. I didn't know if they could see me, but I didn't move the light. I didn't shine it at them. I watched for maybe 5 or 6 minutes, my body completely stiff. Then they turned and walked back into the woods. I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair, the flashlight in one hand, the axe in the other, until dawn. When morning came, I packed everything. I loaded the food, the bedding, all my gear back into the truck. I didn't care that I had 4 more days left on the rental. I didn't care that the contract said no refunds. I just wanted to leave. Before I drove off, I walked to the back of the cabin again, where I had seen the figure standing. There were faint tracks in the soft dirt. Footprints, not boots like mine. Worn shoes. The prints led from the woods to the cabin, then back again, disappearing into the trees. I followed them for a while, maybe 200 feet in, but the ground got hard and covered with leaves and I lost the trail. I got in the truck and drove back the way I came. I didn't stop. I didn't even look back in the mirror. When I got back into cell range, I called the rental site and reported what I'd seen. They said they'd look into it, but I didn't hear back. I looked up the area later, trying to find news or police reports. I didn't find anything useful. No missing persons, no crimes linked to that cabin. I thought about going back, just to see if anything else turned up, but I knew I wouldn't. I still think about that night sometimes. About the figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. They didn't try to get in. They didn't say anything. They just watched. That was enough. Since then, I've gone on other trips. I've hiked in different places, even camped again. But I've never gone that far off-grid again. Never stayed somewhere I couldn't leave quickly. That trip reminded me of something I forgot. Just how vulnerable you really are when you're alone in the woods. No walls, no neighbors, no signal. Just silence and the unknown. And sometimes, that silence watches you back. I had been needing a break from the city for a while. I'd been working 12-hour shifts for months without a real break, and even my weekends were filled with errands, noise, and crowds. It was February 2022, and even though the temperatures were still low, I figured it was a good time to take a few days to myself somewhere quiet. I booked a small cabin in the northern part of Michigan, near a lake called White Hill Lake. It was about a 5-hour drive from where I lived in Toledo, and the pictures on the listing made it look like the perfect kind of getaway I needed. Isolated, small, clean, and surrounded by trees. I left early on a Thursday morning to beat the traffic. I packed simple things, some canned food, instant coffee, a small cooler with milk and eggs, extra batteries, a flashlight, my phone charger, a map, a multi-tool, and a thick coat. I didn't think I'd need anything fancy. The cabin had no internet and barely any cell signal, which was part of the appeal for me. I wanted to be away from everything and everyone for a few days. The drive was smooth. It was cloudy the whole way, and the roads got narrower as I got closer. After the last gas station, I drove for nearly 40 minutes without seeing another car. Eventually, I turned onto a dirt road that led to the cabin. There were tire tracks in the snow, probably from whoever managed the property, and I followed them until I saw the small wooden cabin tucked between tall pines. It looked a little more weathered than the pictures, but nothing too concerning. There was a stack of firewood by the front steps and a locked box with a key on the side, just like the owner said. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and immediately felt that stillness you only get in places far from people. The inside of the cabin was simple. One room with a bed, a wood stove, a table, a small counter with a hot plate, and a bathroom in the back with a working toilet and a small shower stall. No TV, no radio, not even a clock on the wall. Just quiet. I started a fire in the stove with the wood and matches left by the door, unpacked my things, and made a sandwich. I sat at the table and stared out the window for a while. Snow was falling lightly, just a few flakes at a time, and it made the trees look softer. That first night was peaceful. I read a book for a while, ate some instant noodles, and turned in early. The wind picked up after sunset, and I could hear it moving through the trees and brushing against the walls of the cabin. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up to silence. No wind, no creaking, nothing. And then I heard what sounded like footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate crunching in the snow. I held my breath and waited. They stopped after a few seconds. I told myself it could have been a deer or something similar, and after a while, I drifted off again. The next morning, I stepped outside to get some fresh air and checked the firewood. The air was sharp and cold, and I noticed a few tracks in the snow near the side of the cabin. They weren't boot prints, more like irregular shapes, like someone walked with socks or soft shoes. They went from the edge of the woods to the side of the cabin and then disappeared. I stood there staring at them, trying to figure out if they were fresh. They didn't seem too deep, and there was a light layer of new snow over them, so I assumed they were from the day before or even earlier. I tried not to think too much about it and spent the day reading, cooking a small meal, and walking a little along a trail behind the cabin. I didn't go far. There were no signs of people anywhere, just rabbit tracks and broken branches. The wind had picked up again by late afternoon, and I stayed inside with the fire going, keeping myself warm and trying not to let the silence get to me. That night, things felt different. I don't know why. Maybe it was the way the wind sounded, or maybe it was just my nerves. Around midnight, I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard a scraping noise, like wood dragging across wood. It lasted about 5 seconds, then stopped. I got up and walked to the front door, opened it a crack, and looked outside. Nothing. Snow, trees, dark sky. I turned on the flashlight and looked around the edge of the porch. Still nothing. I closed the door, locked it, and went back to bed, but it took me over an hour to fall asleep. My mind kept turning over the possibilities. A branch falling? Some animal? But animals don't drag things. The next morning, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The firewood pile looked different. Not smaller, not bigger, just rearranged. The logs that were stacked evenly the day before now had a small gap in the middle, and some of the wood was at a different angle. It looked like someone had reached in and pulled out a few pieces, but then changed their mind and put them back. Or maybe I was just being paranoid. I told myself I might have done it yesterday and not remembered. I had no proof of anything, so I tried to brush it off. Later that day, while I was boiling some water, I noticed that my multi-tool was gone. I had left it on the counter next to my book, and now it was gone. I checked all around the table, under the bed, in my bag, and in the bathroom. I even checked outside. It was just gone. I sat down and tried to calm myself. I hadn't left the door unlocked. I hadn't seen anyone. But now the tracks, the noises, the firewood, and the missing multi-tool started to connect in a way I didn't like. I kept the flashlight with me for the rest of the day, even while indoors. Around dusk, I heard movement outside again. Not loud, just a faint crunching in the snow, a little ways off. I turned off all the lights and stood near the window, looking out from the corner. The trees were still. The wind had died down again. I didn't see anything, but I knew something or someone was nearby. I waited for almost half an hour, staring, listening, but I never saw a figure. The sounds stopped eventually. I lit the fire again, locked the door, and stayed up most of the night. At around 2:30 a.m., I heard the back door handle rattle. It didn't turn, but it moved, like someone was testing it slowly. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, barely breathing. The sound stopped after a few seconds. Then, 5 minutes later, the sound of snow being stepped on. Slow, careful steps going around the cabin. I turned off the lantern and stayed in the dark, holding the flashlight tightly, ready to shine it if I had to. Eventually, it went quiet again. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I decided I was leaving. I didn't care how much I had paid for the booking. I packed everything quickly, shoved my clothes and food into the bag, and stepped outside to load the car. That's when I saw the handprint. On the back window of my car, just above the trunk, was a handprint. Bare hand, no glove, pressed into the glass. The fingers were long and thin, and the print looked fresh. I touched it, still slightly damp. Whoever had been outside during the night had walked right up to the car and touched it. I felt a wave of nausea. I got in the car and started the engine, but the tires spun. I had parked too far into a soft spot near the side of the cabin, and the snow had built up under the wheels. I tried rocking the car back and forth, moving slowly, but it was stuck. I got out, dug some snow away with a flat piece of firewood, and tried again. Still no luck. I went back inside the cabin to calm down and think. I didn't want to walk 5 miles through the woods in freezing weather to find help, but I also didn't want to stay another night. I thought maybe I could find something around the cabin to help with traction. There was a small old rug in the bathroom. I grabbed it, cut it into strips with a kitchen knife, and wedged the strips under the tires. After 2 more tries, the car finally lurched forward and crawled out of the hole. I didn't even look back at the cabin. I drove straight out of there and didn't stop until I reached a gas station almost an hour later. I pulled over, went inside, bought coffee, and sat at a table for half an hour just to feel like I was around people again. I never got an explanation for what happened. I didn't call the police because I didn't have proof of anything. No faces, no damage, no real evidence. Just small things that kept adding up and a feeling in my gut that someone had been watching me out there. The listing for the cabin disappeared 2 weeks later. I don't know if the owner took it down or if something else happened. I never heard of anything in the news. To this day, I still don't know what kind of person sneaks around a remote cabin in the middle of the woods in winter just to mess with someone and disappear into the trees again. Maybe it was a squatter, maybe someone living off the grid, or maybe just someone who enjoyed the fear they could cause without ever being seen. But I do know this, I'll never stay in a cabin that far from help again. I don't care how peaceful it looks in the pictures. I still remember the week I spent up in the mountains near Roan Creek, Colorado. It was late September of 2017. I had just turned 34, and I needed a break from everything. My job, the constant noise in the city, the people, the pressure. I'd been working at a car repair shop for almost 10 years, and I hadn't taken a real vacation in a long time. I didn't want beaches or tourist spots. I just wanted quiet. So I looked for remote cabins online and found this small, old one about 20 miles from the closest paved road. It was owned by some old couple who rented it out occasionally. They said it was stocked with firewood, basic furniture, and a generator for electricity, but there was no running water or cell service. That was fine by me. I brought my own water in big jugs, food, a first aid kit, flashlights, batteries, and a basic toolkit just in case. I also brought my .22 rifle, not for protection, really, just in case I wanted to go hiking and spotted something I could legally hunt. The drive up was rough, especially the last couple miles. The dirt road was narrow and twisted, surrounded by thick pine and aspen trees. The trees started getting taller and denser the higher I went. I had to take it slow to avoid damaging the undercarriage of my SUV. Eventually, I found the turnoff and spotted the cabin about 100 feet off the main trail, partially hidden by trees. It was smaller than I expected, just one room with a metal roof, a little chimney poking out, and a porch that sagged slightly on one side. The windows were dusty but intact. The door creaked when I opened it. Inside, it smelled like old wood and something slightly musty but not unbearable. There was a small bed in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, a wood-burning stove, some shelves with cooking gear, and a big steel cabinet that held the generator. The fuel for the generator was locked up in a box outside the cabin. I unlocked it with the key the owners gave me and started the generator. It gave off a steady hum that was comforting in a weird way. I shut it off after a couple minutes, just to test it. The first 2 days were peaceful. I hiked around the area, made simple meals, read an old paperback I brought, and kept a small fire going in the stove at night. The weather was cool but not cold. A little fog rolled in at night, but it burned off quickly each morning. There were no other people for miles, and the silence was better than I imagined. It was on the 3rd night that things started to feel off. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night because I thought I heard something outside. Not an animal, something heavier. It was faint, like footsteps in the dirt, just 1 or 2. I froze and held my breath, listening. Nothing followed. No other sounds. I chalked it up to maybe a deer or elk wandering close, rolled over, and tried to sleep again. Still, I kept the rifle next to the bed after that. The next day, I did a sweep around the cabin, looking for any signs of animals. I found some prints that looked like deer a little ways off the trail, but nothing too close to the cabin. I told myself it was probably just my imagination. But that night, the sound came back. this time closer. It was clearer now. I heard the crunch of leaves and sticks under slow steps, one after the other. Then they stopped. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. I didn't turn on any lights. I just sat in the dark with the rifle in my hands, staring at the window. I could see the outline of trees in the moonlight, but not much else. There was no movement, no wind, just complete stillness. I stayed like that for over an hour, listening. Eventually, I fell asleep sitting up. The next morning, I looked again. Nothing was out of place. No tracks, no marks on the ground. But I felt something had changed. The forest didn't feel the same. It felt tighter, like the trees were pressing in a little more than before. I couldn't explain it. Later that day, I walked down the road a bit, maybe a mile or two, just to clear my head. On the way back, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Halfway buried in the dirt near a bend in the trail, there was a crushed beer can, old and rusted. I brushed away some of the dirt and found a torn piece of blue fabric, like from a jacket or shirt. It was stuck under a root. I didn't think much of it at the time. People came through the woods now and then. Hunters, probably. But that night, something happened that I still can't explain. I was lying in bed, the fire low but still burning in the stove. The air was quiet again, too quiet. I heard it, something brushing against the side of the cabin. Not walking this time. It was a soft scrape, like fingers or something being dragged along the wooden wall. Then it stopped. Then it came again on the opposite wall. Slow, steady, deliberate. I stood up slowly, loaded the rifle, and turned on the flashlight. I didn't go outside. I just aimed it through the window and swept the beam across the trees. Nothing. No movement. I waited again, heart pounding, and then I turned the light off and sat down. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I went outside and walked around the cabin. On the far side, low to the ground, I saw faint scratches on the wood. They looked too straight and too narrow to be from animals. More like someone dragging something sharp, but not deep. Just enough to mark the wood. I touched them and felt my stomach turn. I wanted to leave that day, but something stopped me. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I made the scratches myself without realizing. Maybe they were old and I just noticed them now. That afternoon, I decided to go farther out, toward a ridge I saw on the map the owners gave me. It was supposed to give a good view of the area. I packed a snack, some water, and the rifle just in case. The hike took a couple hours. The ridge did have a great view. I could see for miles, trees, rocks, even the dirt road I had driven up on. I stayed up there for a bit, just breathing in the cold air. On the way back, I took a different path down, thinking I'd loop back to the cabin from the other side. That's when I saw something that really scared me. About 200 yards off the trail, I spotted a small clearing with what looked like an old, half-collapsed tent. It was faded green, sun-bleached, with one side completely caved in. I walked closer, staying quiet. There were old clothes scattered nearby, a boot, an empty bottle, and a rusted camp stove. Everything looked like it had been sitting there for years. But then I saw something that didn't belong. Fresh footprints in the dirt leading to and from the tent. They weren't mine. The shape was different. Larger boots, deeper impressions. Whoever made them had been here recently. I turned around and made my way back to the cabin fast, trying to stay calm. The air felt colder as I walked. My brain kept trying to make sense of things, but nothing added up. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to give off any light. I turned off the generator. I sat in total darkness, listening. Around midnight, I heard the steps again. They came from the back of the cabin, moved slowly toward the front, then stopped by the porch. I could hear the boards creak under the weight. Then nothing. I sat there in the dark, gripping the rifle, not breathing. I didn't move until the sun came up. That morning, I found footprints on the porch, big, muddy, and deep. Whoever it was had been standing right at the door. I packed everything and loaded the SUV in under 20 minutes. I didn't even bother sweeping or cleaning up. I just left. On the way down the road, maybe 5 miles out, I saw something in the distance. A man walking along the road, away from the cabin. He was wearing a dark jacket and faded jeans. His pace was slow, steady. He didn't look at me as I passed. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. When I got back to the nearest town, I told the sheriff what I had seen. The old tent, the footprints, the scratching sounds, the man. He nodded and said people sometimes came out into the woods to disappear, that there had been reports of missing campers in the past, but nothing ever came of them. He didn't seem surprised, just tired. I drove home the next day. I haven't gone camping since. I still think about the man I saw, about the tent, about the scratches. I think someone had been living out there, watching, maybe waiting. Maybe he didn't like that I was in what he thought was his space. Maybe he'd scared off others before. Maybe not everyone made it out. But I did. I made it out. I don't care if I was paranoid. I trust my gut now. That trip changed the way I look at the woods. Not everything out there is wild. Some of it is worse. Some of it is human.